A certain Mr. Bulla Felix was the leader of a 600-strong band of bandits that included runaway slaves, imperial freedmen, and petty criminals. Bulla Felix's bandits committed highway robberies, but never killed their victims. They only robbed the property of nobles and distributed it among the poor and members of the gang. To increase their effectiveness, the bandits also created a spy network that allows them to ambush ships preparing to leave the port in Brundisium in southern Italy. Bulla Felix and his men stopped ships and took everything they could, but they never took part in the gratuitous murder of innocent merchants and sailors. In the end, the infamous group was active during the reign of Emperor Septimius Severus, who declared Bulla Felix his personal enemy. Septimius Severus was a talented and successful commander, whose legions won several important battles in Britain, but were unable to stop the gang that committed atrocities in his homeland. The famous historian Cassius Dio claimed that Bulla Felix successfully evaded capture because he was a master of disguise. One day the bandits made a plan for Bulla Felix to dress up as a supposed magistrate or Roman centurion and convince the nobles that he was actually sent to protect them. Then he robbed the nobles and escaped with the help of a network of accomplices who prepared shelters for such cases. In the general account, Bulla Felix managed to evade the Roman authorities for 2 years of his activity, but he was captured in 207, when he tried to disguise himself, but was suspected and discovered by the Praetorian prefect. The governor of Praetoria, the famous Roman jurist Papinian, interrogated him. Having learned during the conversation that he was dealing with an outstanding person, the famous lawyer bitterly asked, "How can someone like you become a robber?" In response, Papinian said, "How can a man like you become the governor of Praetoria?" In the end, Bulla Felix was sentenced by a court to death by killing wild animals in the center of Rome's Colosseum, while his former victims mocked his death. In the 2nd century, Emperor Hadrian, while in Judea, decided to rebuild Jerusalem, which had been destroyed during the First Jewish War, and renamed it Aelia Capitolina, founding a Roman pagan temple of Jupiter. These actions caused unrest that, after the emperor's departure from the Syrian lands in 130 CE, led to a massive Jewish revolt. At the head of the Jewish rebels was one Shimon bar Kokhba, nicknamed Bar Kokhba. He was a man from a bandit environment, but relying on his name, claimed that he was like a light of God, magically descended from heaven, will enlighten all the oppressed and suffering. Thanks to the efforts of Rabbi Akiva, a respected and well-known Jewish theologian of those times, the revolt quickly gained momentum and even drove the Roman troops out of the territory of Israel. The war reached its climax when the leader of the revolt captured Jerusalem, proclaimed himself king, and began to mint his own coinage. However, the empire was not going to simply give up its position. From Britain was summoned the most successful Roman commander of the time, Julius Severus. Thanks to his active actions, the rebels were forced out of Jerusalem and all the previously captured lands. Bar Kokhba with the last rebels took refuge in the impregnable fortress of Betar. After a year of desperate resistance and exhaustion of the rebels by hunger and thirst, the fortress finally fell in 135 AD Bar Kokhba, and almost all the last rebels were killed within its walls. The survivors were severely punished and executed. The result of the unrest was the destruction of hundreds of thousands of Jews, the final destruction of Jerusalem, and the foundation of the Roman city of Aelia Capitolina in its place in honor of the Emperor Publius Elias Trajan Hadrian and the god Jupiter of Capital. The emperor also forbade, on pain of death, Jewish rituals, the teaching and study of the Mosaic Law, circumcision, and the visit of circumcised Jews to the former Jerusalem, so that they could not even see their ancestral home from afar. Thus, the city became devoid of a nation of Jews and was colonized by foreigners, and the province of Judea was renamed Syria-Palestine by Hadrian.
Were the citizens of ancient Rome prejudiced against people of color? Generally speaking, no. In the history of the Roman Empire, the Black Emperor Septimius Severus was known. He became emperor after he defeated another pretender to the post, who was named Gaius Pescennius Niger in a civil war. Ancient Roman historians did not emphasize and usually did not even mention the skin color of historical figures, from which we can conclude that they did not attach importance to it. The concept of race itself is very late. It only emerged in modern times and became politically relevant in the colonial era. But to answer the question of whether the Romans had other prejudices concerning appearance, yes, they did. For example, in relation to redheads. This color of hair was considered a marker of slavery and lowliness. There was even a nickname, Rufus, that is, red, meaning red-haired. This is because there were many Celts among the slaves, whom the Romans called Gauls, among whom red hair is much more common than among the Mediterranean peoples. The Emperor Caligula once even ordered that all prisoners who were led behind his chariot during his triumphal procession be dyed red hair. Xenophobia was no less prevalent in ancient Rome than in any other country or time. The Romans were prejudiced against the Greeks, who were regarded as pampered butchers, talkative and wicked. All northerners, especially Germans, were regarded as clumsy, rude and savage. The Orientals were regarded by the Romans as crafty and cunning, and the Egyptians as sorcerers. There was no particular prejudice against people from more distant countries like India and China. The Romans simply did not encounter them. In the beginning of their history, the Romans disliked especially their nearest relatives and neighbors, the Etruscans and other Italian tribes, but in time they merged with them. All the natives of Italy from some point in time began to be regarded as true Romans. The most important distinction between people, from the Roman point of view, was that they belonged to the Roman civilization. Cultural chauvinism was always present in ancient Rome and was the basis of the ancient Roman mentality. Either you walk in a toga, wash in the Thermae, and speak Latin, or you are a filthy savage barbarian. At best, you're a filthy, corrupt Greek, Syrian, Egyptian, Cilician. This was the central belief of the Romans. The Roman was convinced that Roman values and lifestyles were superior to all other cultures and civilizations, and Roman legions carried the light of Roman culture into the darkness of savagery and barbarism by building roads, thermae, temples, and stadiums in conquered provinces. The color of the skin of both the legionaries and the barbarians, whom the legionaries introduced to the achievements of the highest, that is, Roman civilization, did not matter. A born Syrian, Ethiopian, or Scythian who fought in an auxiliary cavalry unit somewhere in Germany or Britain was an insider to a Roman. A blonde, blue-eyed Celtic Briton or German from a local tribe was an outsider, a savage, and a barbarian, fit at best to be a slave. So the Romans did not suffer from racism, but they had chauvinism, which was the basis of the entire Roman culture and civilization.
The cuisine of ancient Rome was both similar and different to that of Italy today. In antiquity, of course, there were absolutely no products that came to us from the New World. No ketchup, no chili peppers, no beans, no potatoes. Beef was barely eaten, and the main and most popular meat dish, like chicken nowadays, was hare. There were more fish in the sea than now, so fish and seafood made up a large part of the menu. Only now Mediterranean oysters are a delicacy, but back then they were quite the everyday food of coastal dwellers. In Rome they grew cabbage, mostly lettuce, not cabbage, peas, carrots, cucumbers. It is known that the Emperor Tiberius was a terrible lover of cucumbers, ordered them to be grown all year round, and never went anywhere without his supply of cucumbers. The Romans started their lunches with boiled eggs and ended with apples, so they even have the expression from egg to apple, that is, from the very beginning to the very end. So the simplest dishes haven't changed at all since then. For example, here's a recipe for fried tuna from an ancient cookbook. Take the tail of tuna, cut it into pieces and fry it completely, season the fish only with salt, drizzle with oil, and dip it in a strong brine. Nothing has changed here. The simplest peasant food since ancient times has been pulses. It was made mainly from wheat or barley flour. Now modern Italians make exactly the same from corn flour and call it polenta. Sometimes this same pulse was dried in the sun and then broken into pieces and boiled. This is where the modern abundance of Italian pasta comes from. The Romans liked bread very much and had over 70 types of bread: yeast bread, yeast-free bread, wheat bread, barley bread, oat bread, and rye bread. They were the first to think of adding raisins, dried fruits, olives, pieces of sausage, meat, and nuts to the bread dough. So when you buy a ciabatta with olives at the store, you're also eating quite the ancient Roman dish. But that's all simple, vernacular cuisine. But what about the high cuisine of the ancient Roman nobility? Have any of the Roman recipes survived to this day? We know the Roman culinary. It was written in the 1st century AD by the famous rich man and gourmet, Gavius Apicius. He was famous as an inventor of new dishes. For example, it is believed that he invented blood sausage. The dishes he describes are difficult to replicate because they all necessarily use the famous Roman garum sauce, which has not survived to this day. It was made from fermented fish. Nowadays, such sauces are used in Oriental cuisines, but once it was a mainstay of Roman cooking. However, we can repeat another Roman sauce that had no name, or rather, there were many names, depending on the composition of the herbs. It was also offered as a sauce for most dishes. It was a mixture of herbs, root of mint, lovage, celery, dill, and parsley in various combinations, ground into a paste and diluted with olive oil, vinegar, or wine, and honey. What's not a pesto sauce? High cuisine was complex and exotic. The Romans could cook sausages and pâtés, pork nipples and nightingale tongues, sea urchins and liver sausages. But all this was stuffed with roughly the same set of herbs, drizzled with wine, vinegar, garum, and honey, and was probably unpalatable to modern tastes. There are many adaptations of Apicius recipes for modern tastes on the web. There is, however, an exception here as well. The most common way of cooking meat in antiquity was double. First boil it, and then roast it. From our point of view, this is overkill, which only deprives meat of any flavor. However, French cooks at the end of the 20th century tried to repeat one of the recipes described by Apicius. It is precisely boiled and then roasted duck with herbs. Since then, Roman duck, or Apicius duck, is on the menu of many restaurants, and you can cook it yourself. The emancipated women laughed at by Roman poets of the imperial period were unthinkable in early Rome, which was known for its harsh mores and rigid laws. Roman women were officially considered the weaker sex in need of male tutelage. Unmarried ladies were taken care of by their fathers, older relatives, or, in their absence, by a guardian appointed by the praetor. Ancient Roman women, by law, had no right to dispose of their own or their family property without a man's consent. But as early as the late Republic, the famous orator Cicero complained about wives hiring skillful lawyers who found various ways to circumvent this law. The problem arose from the fact that Roman aristocrats could go off to war or on state affairs to distant provinces and not be seen in the capital for years. If a husband did not leave his wife a power of attorney, she could not spend money even on the bare necessities of life in his absence. Women were disadvantaged in literally everything. They had no right to adopt anyone, even as widows. Here it should be noted that a widow who did not remarry acquired full rights over inherited property, but only if there were no male heirs in the family. A man could buy a slave, give her a free hand, and marry her. But women of the upper classes were forbidden to marry former slaves. Ancient Roman women also had no right to serve in the army, to take part in popular assemblies, to vote for laws, to elect, and to be elected. In contrast to the property rights that they were gradually gaining, already Emperor Octavian gave full property rights to wives who had 3 or more children. Ancient Roman women did not receive political rights. This, however, did not prevent the most active of them from participating in politics through their husbands. For example, according to Titus Livy, his mother-in-law Sulpicia was actively assisting the then consul in investigating the Bacchus cult scandal. Still, Roman law provided women with a certain amount of protection. In imperial times, young women gained the right to choose their own guardians. Marriage contracts became widespread, securing women's rights to property acquired within the family. Divorce became common. Seneca wrote of matrons who divorced 10 or more times. Women, through proxies, could bring legal action, including against their relatives, something that would have been unthinkable in the earlier centuries of Roman history. Even in politics, considered completely closed to women, they had certain opportunities. Already at the end of the 3rd century BC, the general indignation of Roman ladies forced the Senate to cancel the law of Appius, adopted after severe defeats in the early period of the Second Punic War, and directed against excessive luxury, too expensive female attire, jewelry, etc., so the senators sought to keep this law even after the war. But the harsh protests of the female section of Roman society prevented them from realizing this dream. In imperial times, there was even a public organization of aristocratic ladies, called Ordo Matronorum. Unfortunately, no information about its activities has been preserved. What do you think about this? Did Roman men do the right thing for their women? Was it caring or patriarchal tyranny? Many people know the legend of the she-wolf who nurtured the twins, but this is not the only version of how Rome was founded. There are myths in which a divine phallus is responsible for the birth of the famous twins, and there are those where Romulus and Remus did not exist, and the glory for the founding of the city entrusted to a woman. But come on, now you will hear it all for yourselves. Version 1. Classic. Once upon a time there lived a Trojan prince Aeneas, son of the goddess Venus. He was doing well until his mother won the oldest beauty contest in history, and by directly bribing the judge. That judge was Paris, to whom Venus promised the love of the most beautiful of all mortal women, Helen. Helen was married to the king of Sparta. When she escaped with Paris, taking her husband's treasury, all of Greece gathered to return the unfaithful wife. In the war that broke out, Troy perished. Aeneas, with his mother's help, was able to escape from the burning city. Soon a small group of surviving Trojans rallied around him. Then, Aeneas had a divine illumination. It turns out that a great destiny awaits him. His family is destined to found the greatest city on earth. A handful of refugees from Troy set out to wander the seas in search of a new home. Overcoming many obstacles, they found themselves in Italy. After a small victorious war against the natives, Aeneas married the daughter of the king of the Latins, Lavinia. Their son founded the city of Alba Longa, and Aeneas' family ruled there happily until a coup d'état occurred in one generation. One brother deposed another and seized power, and enlisted that brother's daughter as a vestal, so that the line might be broken up. This daughter's name was Rhea Silvia, and she swore that she was pregnant by Mars himself. For who else but a god could infringe on the sacred virginity of a vestal? When she gave birth to twins, the evil usurper uncle ordered them drowned in the river. But they were not ordinary children, but divine ones, so the river carried them to a hill, where a she-wolf found them and fed them. Soon the twins were taken to the local shepherd, Faustulus. He and his wife had no children, so he took the foundlings and raised them. They were named Romulus and Remus. The twins, now grown up, were brought together by fate with their overthrown grandfather, who identified them by signs and comparisons. Discovering the secret of their origins, the twins killed the usurper and returned the throne to their grandfather. They themselves decided to found a new city. When they drew the sacred boundary of the city, Romulus said that no one would ever desecrate that boundary with impunity. Remus decided to make a joke at the wrong time and mockingly jumped over the line, for which he was killed by his own brother. Romulus named the city Rome. This was April 21, 753 BC. Version 2. Female influence. After the destruction of Troy, the remnants of the Trojans wandered around the world on ships for a long time. One day they landed near the mouth of the Tiber River. The women by then were tired of wandering the seas, and they wanted to stop. Among them was a certain Roma, apparently in a position of authority. She came up with an ingenious plan to set fire to the ships, and then the men would have no choice but to stay here. Apparently the ladies were so desperate that the plan was accepted with gusto. The men, of course, scolded. But there was nothing they could do. The ships had burned to the ground. They began to investigate the area, and it turned out that the land here was fertile, the neighbors were intellectuals, the climate was perfect, just like heaven on earth. Everyone began to thank Roma for her determination, and the city was eventually named after her. Version 3. Phallic. Once in the bedroom of King Alba Longa, a miracle happened. Out of the hearth, right out of the fire, rose the most real phallus. It rose and stayed there for days on end. The soothsayers all agreed that it wasn't just standing there, but that he was waiting for a worthy woman to give birth to someone obviously great. The king realized everything and called one of his daughters with orders to conceive urgently from this vision. The daughter, of course, was horrified, and in her place she secretly sent her maid on this honorable mission. The king, learning of this deception, was furious and wanted to execute both of them. But then the goddess Vesta appeared in his dream and forbade their execution. So the girls survived, and soon the maid gave birth to twins. It was Romulus and Remus, who gave the king no rest, so he had them killed. But the killer had a conscience and left the children on the riverbank instead of killing them. Then, as in a Disney cartoon, birds began to arrive and bring them food in their beaks, and the she-wolf fed them with her milk. That's how the children survived until a shepherd found them. He rescued and raised them, and the adult twins then attacked the king and killed him for revenge, and later founded the city of Rome. Bread in circuses. This phrase is now known to everyone. The Roman satirist Juvenal characterized with these words the basic aspirations of his countrymen, and he was so accurate in this that the phrase became an ancient Roman meme and has come down to this day. The ancient Romans did indeed know a great deal about spectacle, and just like today's viewers, they loved action movies, horror movies, comedies, dramas, sports, and military parades. Only they had it all arranged a little differently, and referred to by the common word games. At first, most of them were religious ceremonies of one sort or another, dedicated to the gods and religious festivals. But as time went on, they became more and more common entertainment. The climate favorable to farming, the advanced tax system, the spoils of war and tribute from the provinces filled the Roman coffers, and the money bags of the ruling nobility. As a result, the Romans could afford many interesting things, so to speak, at the expense of the budget. In order to distract the population from social or political discontent, those in power practiced free distribution of bread, oil, and wine, and, of course, a variety of spectacles. So, what did the ancient Roman television show citizens in order to make them think less about social problems? Gladiatorial games. Even the Etruscans, who were one of the ancestors of the ancient Romans, had a funerary rite. Men armed with swords fought to the death over a fresh grave, destined to be sacrificed to the gods. The Romans inherited this tradition, developed it, deepened, and expanded it. Thousands of warriors, convicts, and slaves, free professional fighters, condemned to death criminals, dangerous animals, and even, since a certain historical moment, women took part in gladiatorial games of ancient Rome. Not only that, fighting gladiators was not shameful for noble citizens and even Roman emperors. However, they did it only at their own will. The gladiatorial arenas hosted deadly duels and battles, staged famous or mythical battles, fights with beasts, and other cruel performances. The audience often participated in deciding the fate of the defeated by voting on whether to kill the fallen or let them live. This, of course, created a powerful sense of ownership of the event and was intoxicating in its own way. Naumachie. Translated from ancient Greek, it means sea battles. However, it took place not on the sea, but in artificial reservoirs specially created for the dramatization of sea battles. Gladiators, as well as prisoners of war and those condemned to execution, took part in the Naumachis. Tribunes were erected along the banks, and the famous and celebrated sea battles were reproduced on the water. It was all grown up, real ships, real weapons, and real death. The decks were cracking, the ships were burning and sinking. People were dying by the thousands, as in a real war, and the audience was enthralled. Beast Hunt. This entertainment included a wide variety of animal shows, from the innocent, such as the usual display of strange foreign animals, training miracles and tricks, to bloody hunts and duels. Bears, tigers, lions, bulls, and panthers were pitted against each other and pitted against people. Thousands of people and animals killed each other. The shows included professional animal trainers and bestiary tamers, as well as ordinary gladiators, and in the good old Roman tradition, criminals condemned to death. For example, before Rome abandoned paganism, it was very popular to publicly feed some Christians to hungry lions. The victims might be given weapons, and then the execution would be longer and more interesting. The performances with animals were often erotic in nature. Mythological plots, which the Romans were very fond of, often contained episodes of human intercourse with animals, including sexual violence. Such scenes were also played out in the arena in front of all the honest people. But not all spectacles in ancient Rome were of such a cruel and unbridled nature. Among the more cultural activities is theater, for example. The Roman theater inherited the traditions of the ancient Greek theater, but in many ways it lost the serious Enlightenment character and pathos that the Greek theater had. Besides tragedies and comedies, the Roman theater had many simpler and lower genres, and the profession of acting was not as respected. Most often the actors were slaves or freedmen. Among the genres of the Roman stage one could find sums, performances of magicians and acrobats, mimes, small farces with pokes and slaps, pantomimes, dancing performances without words, atellans, short and sometimes crude farces, comic scenes of everyday life, satiras, which included both words and singing and dancing with music, mocking and sarcastic songs, pheasantines, poetic games were also practiced in the Roman theater. Attendance at the theater was free for free Romans. Slaves were not allowed in theaters. Sporting games. You have probably already noticed that a variety of competitions the Romans were very fond of, in ancient Rome regularly held one or another sports games, which practiced the competition of athletes, fencing, wrestling, running, jumping, fistfights. The Capitoline Games, dedicated to Jupiter, were a Roman copy of the ancient Greek Olympic Games and included both athletic competitions and, in later stages, competitions of singers and musicians. From ancient initiation rites grew the Trojan Games, the equestrian performances of young men from noble families. Chariot races took place on special hippodromes and were particularly beloved by the public. Fans rooting for different teams could cause riots if they were not happy with the results. The winners of the races received wealth and popularity. Triumph. This special solemn ceremony was awarded as a reward if the victory was overwhelming and a great number of enemies were killed. The whole of Rome came out to greet the victorious general returning from the war. It was a grandiose show. The triumphator entered the city on a gilded chariot, sumptuously dressed, surrounded by his family. A special slave held a laurel wreath above his head and whispered in his ear at the same time, "Remember death," so that he would not become too conceited. Behind him rode commanders and comrades in arms, then compatriots freed from enemy captivity, and after, soldiers in full parade, at the top of their lungs singing both praise and mockery for the triumphant. But the most interesting part of the procession was the captured booty, weapons, gold and silver, statues and paintings, precious utensils, cloth and other treasures, painted sacrificial cattle. Here the noble prisoners, kings and commanders with their families and cronies. At times there were so many trophies that their entry into the city dragged on for 2 or 3 days. The procession was accompanied by artists, mimes, magicians, acrobats, and jugglers entertained the crowd as much as they could. It is interesting that all these entertainments in ancient Rome were not show business. Their attendance was free of charge. Moreover, the organizers of games and performances were obliged to provide the spectators with festive refreshments and drinks at their own expense. Bread and circuses. What the citizens of ancient Rome traded for these things is now hard to say. The Roman Emperor Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, who went down in history under the nickname Caligula, had a favorite horse. Originally, the frisky light gray stallion's name was Porcellus, which literally means piglet. But then he began winning races, and Caligula decided to give his pet a more euphonious name. He called him Quickfoot, which is Latin for Encitatus. Thanks to the emperor, Encitatus became one of the most famous horses in world history. Caligula ordered the stables of Encitatus to be decorated with marble, the manger to be made of ivory, and the drinker of gold. Encitatus had his own blanket of purple, that is his imperial color, adorned with pearls. But then the emperor decided that even this was not enough, settling Encitatus in a special palace with his own servants. There Caligula received guests invited there on behalf of his beloved stallion. And so that Encitatus lived a full family life, he was married to a mare named Penelope. The marriage was formalized. For this purpose, Encitatus was made a citizen of Rome according to all the rules. Before the races, any noise was forbidden near Encitatus' chambers under penalty of death. At feasts, Caligula shared the meal with his pet, offering him the most delicious dishes and wines. The horse was entertained. Not only slaves but also the emperor's wife danced in front of him. Everyone present raised their cups to the health of Encitatus. But that was not the end of Encitatus' career. Caligula inducted him into the Roman Senate and put him on the list of candidates for consular office. When the emperor declared himself a god, he appointed a priestly college, as was his custom. He also enrolled Encitatus as a priest of this college. Caligula set a price of 8 million sesterces for assuming this office. So that the horse would have such a sum, on his behalf all horses were levied with tribute. The 4-legged horse that did not pay it was sent to the slaughterhouse. Eventually, Caligula declared Encitatus to be the incarnation of all gods, and supplemented the oath to the Roman state with the words, "For the welfare and good fortune of Encitatus." Luck, however, ended after Caligula's death. Encitatus was transferred to a regular stable, but it was not so easy to exclude him from the Senate. According to Roman law, a senator had to remain in office until his term expired. Then the new emperor, Claudius, cut the Encitatus salary. Left without funds, the horse was excluded from the list of senators as not having passed the financial census. At the same time, Claudius remarked that Encitatus under Caligula, unlike many other senators, did not give a single stupid advice, did not kill anyone, and did not initiate a single war. Thus ended the remarkable career of this force, around whom so many historical events occurred. It is believed that by introducing his favorite into the Senate, Caligula was thus demonstrating his omnipotence, and also ridiculed the Roman senators, who obediently fulfilled any, even the most bizarre of his whims.
Can a riot be stopped with just one phrase? Let's travel back to 47 BC. Just imagine a crowd of angry legionnaires in the square, making loud noises and expressing their discontent. Suddenly the figure of Julius Caesar appears in front of them, throwing only one word to the masses: "Quirites." Hearing this, the legionaries not only stopped their mutiny, but begged the dictator for forgiveness. Why did this happen? That's what we're going to talk about today. In the summer of 47 BC, Gaius Julius Caesar was 53 years old. He spent many years away from his homeland, fighting with the Gauls, then against his former friend and co-emperor Gnaeus Pompeius Magna. At the same time, he had to fight with various local rulers, trying to test the strength of the shaken because of the civil war, the power of Rome. Here and in 47, he had just returned from a war against Pharnaces II, son of the great Mithridates VI, king of Pontus, who wanted to restore the empire of his ancestors. In the days of his youth, Julius Caesar would probably have shown wonders of bravery in this war, drawn up a cunning plan, and eventually defeated the enemy after several years. But now the Roman general was no more. He had recently conquered not only Egypt, but also the heart of its queen, the beautiful Cleopatra, who bore him a son, who was named Caesar Ion in honor of his father. And his father was obviously tired of constant warfare, although in these wars he won victory after victory. Having received news of the rebellion of Pharnaces, Caesar did not even begin to waste time to gather troops, and with a small detachment landed in Cilicia. Why here? First, so that you do not have to go far, because Pontus was located very close. Secondly, in this area was recently defeated by Caesar Gnaeus Domitius Calvin with the remnants of his legions. Third, not far from Cilicia was Galatia, which was ruled by King Diotar, who supported Caesar's rival, Gnaeus Pompey Magna. To both of them Caesar said roughly the following: "You are guilty before me, but I will forgive you, in the event that you give me troops for the war against Pharnaces." Both politicians, Roman and Maloasian, did not argue with the victorious Caesar and obediently gave him what he demanded. Caesar went on a campaign, met the army of Pharnaces near the city of Zela, now it is the territory of Turkey, and defeated it in 3 days. Then he went home to Rome, having sent a message to the Senate. Previously, Caesar would paint his great victory, and then would compose memoirs about this war, but now he limited himself to literally 3 words: veni, vidi, vici, came, saw, won. It was a turbulent time in Rome. Citizens were dissatisfied with rising prices and interest charged for late payments, and soldiers resented the fact that they were not given dismissals and the land they were entitled to upon retirement. The veterans were angry and demanded the privileges due them. When Caesar realized that a bloody rebellion was coming, he immediately began to restore order in the empire. He cancelled some of the debts and issued a law on loans, more favorable to citizens. In doing so, he tried to pacify the rebellious population. But even this was not enough, because the soldiers' rebellion was quite dangerous, as Caesar realized that he would not be able to resist an entire army, in case of an attack by rebellious veterans. When the legionaries gathered on the field of Mars, Caesar's advisors suggested that he should not meet with the soldiers, but he still went to the podium. Upon seeing the dictator, the soldiers began to shout their demands loudly. Caesar said literally the following: "You are dismissed, disperse, citizens." The whole point was in that last word. Citizens, meaning civilians, was not how the military was addressed in ancient Rome. Caesar made it clear that all rebels were henceforth considered civilians. Among other things, this meant that they would not be taken to a new war in Africa, where rich booty was expected. They would only receive their due pay and nothing more. However, many soldiers after such an incident literally begged the dictator to take them with him again for another war. Caesar, of course, pretended to doubt, but still forgave the soldiers and sent the legion in another battle. The main instigators of the rebellion still received punishment in the form of a reduction in the promised rewards, but thanks to the coolness of Caesar still managed to suppress a very dangerous for Rome rebellion.
At first glance it sounds paradoxical, doesn't it? After all, the legionaries, the army above all, was obliged to preserve and protect the state from any enemy. But strangely enough, it was the army that led to the collapse of the once greatest state, which she herself had created for centuries. It all began when the army became professional. Previously, there had been a conscription of young men in the event of warfare, and this system worked quite well up to a certain point. The important point was that a soldier, once discharged from the legion, did not move to another class. He remained a vintner, potter, or whatever else he wanted to be, but not a soldier. This was changed by the reforms of Gaius Marius. After Rome had suffered terrible losses as a result of the war with the Cimmerians and Teutons, the army began to recruit everyone, and in the process of training instilled in them the skills of combat and discipline. This is how a special class of population emerged, the legionaries. Thanks to the reforms, Rome succeeded in its expansion, expanding its borders relentlessly. Gaul, Syria, Egypt, Greece, and many other states were crushed by the ruthless Roman military machine. Rome was growing, so more and more legions were needed, and there was no shortage of volunteers. This is when the first stirrings began to arise in the soldier milieu. The fact that each legion identified itself with a particular commander, for which soldiers were ready in fire and in water, and the commander generously shared the spoils with them. All in all, there was a kind of symbiosis, but the distant Senate could appoint anyone at any time, with no regard for the opinions of the legionnaires. That's why the legions destroyed the Republic, bringing to power Caesar, beloved by the soldiers. But that was only the beginning. From the time of Nero onward, everything went wrong. The legions became more and more involved in politics, overthrowing and elevating emperors one by one. It often happened that the future ruler did not want this, but the soldiers simply forced him to do it. For example, Vespasianus Flavius simply threatened to kill him if he refused. The Praetorians were not lagging behind, as they staged a series of palace coups. A stable political system was out of the question. At the same time, it cannot be said that the emperors did not try to curb the willful soldiers. Septimius Severus dispersed Praetorians by distant garrisons. He incidentally began the practice of hiring foreigners in the legions, far from Roman politics. Diocletian continued this endeavor. He even moved his residence out of Rome. But in this case, the cure turned out to be worse than the disease. The number of foreigners in the army was steadily increasing. In fact, the Romans themselves were arming their own enemies. The proportion of the Roman population was steadily decreasing and the cities were declining. The population of Rome was reduced from 2 million people in 200 years to 100,000. The army had essentially become gangs, led by warlords of varying degrees of ambition. Naturally, under such conditions, the preservation of the country was out of the question, and soon it happened. At first, there was no payment for legionaries for the service, because this work was the duty of any citizen, so even the Romans had to buy weapons for their own money. The protection of the state made people leave all personal interests aside. Only a wealthy citizen was fit for service. He stood up for the defense of the state and understood why he was doing it. It was only in the 4th century BC that Roman soldiers began to receive a stipendium. Although it is correct to call it not salary, but cover for maintenance expenses. First of all, it concerned equipment, weapons, and food. In the middle of the 2nd century, the amount of such payments was about 120 denarii per year. A century later, Caesar raised this sum almost twice, to 225 denarii annually. Centurions were entitled to increased pay. Under Caesar, they were paid 450 denarii. Although at the same time, the main source of income for the soldiers were bonuses from commanders and trophies from the service. Centurions were also entitled to double bonuses. In addition, they could have earned an extraordinary prize. Cassius Sceva, Caesar's honorary centurion, once received as many as 2,000 sesterces upon a difficult battle. Only military leaders' generosity determined the limits of such rewards. At the same time, pensions were not provided, although some military leaders gifted their veterans with land plots, which was an excellent incentive to go to war. Among them are Maria, Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, and Octavian Augustus. When Egypt fell under the attack of the Roman army in 29 BC, Octavian gave 1,000 sesterces to 120,000 of his soldiers as bonuses, which was equal to their annual salaries. Somewhat later, August reformed the army and ordered to give retired soldiers either a plot of land outside the Italian peninsula or a monetary payment from the state. At the end of the Augustan era, The soldier's bonus was equal to 3,000 denarii.
Augustus created a fund to pay pensions to legionnaires and himself made the first contribution. Further, this fund was maintained at the expense of taxpayers.
But all the same, the salary and pension for the soldiers were small. Shortly after Augustus' death, the legions in Pannonia and the Rhine rebelled. The rebel soldiers demanded an increase in service payments to 16 acerei per day and a reduction in the period of service to 16 years. Unfortunately, this rebel was suppressed, and the soldiers' demands remained unsatisfied. Originally, the Roman legion was a city militia that gathered only to wage war and disbanded at the end of it. The legion included spearmen, javelin throwers, and a small number of cavalry, which included wealthy citizens from the upper class. However, such an army was only suitable for raids on neighbors, so in the middle of the 4th century BC, a reform was carried out. The legions stopped disbanding, and now the soldiers were paid a salary to maintain their equipment. The legion was now divided into maniples, separate combat units, which increased its maneuverability. If the phalanx, which was an indivisible, dense formation of spearmen, was vulnerable in a battle on rough terrain due to a breakdown in formation, then a maneuverable arrangement avoided this disadvantage and generally made it possible for more flexible tactics. For example, it became possible to withdraw part of the legion from the battle and replace it with another without losing organization. The fighters began to be divided primarily by experience and not by the type of weapons. The youngest warriors who had just joined the legion, armed with a short sword, a tower shield, and having light armor, were called hastati and made up the first line of battle order. Following them were the principals, the same swordsmen, but more experienced, having served for about 10 years. They made up the main force of the Roman army. The last to stand were the most experienced and oldest warriors, the triarii, armed with spears. It was really hard, then the triarii covered the regrouping of the legion in dense formation, or, maneuvering, repelled attacks from the rear and flanks. In this regard, in Rome there was a saying, "It came to the triarii," which meant a critical state of affairs. Lightly armed shooters, velites, were between battle formations and moved according to the situation in battle. The flanks of the legion were covered by cavalry from equites, the upper class who had power and privileges. Later, the cavalry detachments of the allied peoples also became part of the cavalry. Each legion was divided into 10 cohorts of 360 people. The cohorts, in turn, were divided into 3 maniples of 120 fighters. The maniples were divided into 2 centuries, and the centuries into 6 dozen. At the head of each centuria was a commander, a centurion, and the legion was led by 2 consuls. Such a structure and the possibilities of construction arising from it more than once proved their effectiveness in battles both with the Latins and Greeks, and with the Punians and Macedonians, who used the most effective system of the previous era, the phalanx. However, there was a problem of the heterogeneity of the troops, since some soldiers could not afford a complete set of equipment, which affected the combat capability of the detachment. In addition, the wars with Carthage show that the infantry needed support in the form of strong cavalry. Therefore, in 107 BC, Gaius Marius reformed the army. The maniples were abolished, and the remaining components of the legion, the cohorts, became less specialized. Each legionary now had several small darts, a short gladius sword, a dagger, a large shield, and heavy armor covering most of his body. It no longer mattered whether the person was Roman or Latin. The armament came at the expense of the state. The service life was 20 years, and after the service, the soldier received a land allotment. Soldiers were also paid higher salaries. The legions of the empire period were somewhat self-sufficient. Each legion was accompanied by specialists, engineers, lawyers, medical workers. Centuries were now numbered. The centurion was called primipal and was the assistant commander of the legion. His centurion was made up of selected warriors. The cavalry became more heavily armed and numerous, but it remained forever only an auxiliary part of the army. One of the reasons for the collapse of the Roman Empire was the weakening of the army. During the late Empire, the Romans began to rely more and more on mercenaries. There was no longer enough land for everyone, and the peoples of the steppe in several major battles showed that heavy cavalry was better than infantry in battle. But it was the Romans who proved that the organization and control of troops on the battlefield is much more important than their quantity, and sometimes quality. The Romans laid the foundations of the military system that are still used today.
Soccer is perceived by many as a modern invention, but in fact various ball games have been known since ancient times. Not surprisingly, the Romans also had a ball game. This game was called harpastum and was very beloved by the Romans. It was usually played in the baths to warm up properly before the water procedures. The ancient Greek writer Athenaeus and one of the early Christian bishops Sidonius Apollinarius spoke highly of the game, and the famous Roman physician Galen believed that it was better than wrestling or running, because it exercised every part of the body, took little time and cost nothing. Unfortunately, we know very little about how this ancient Roman game was played. Apparently, it was something between soccer and rugby. Many ancient Greek writers note that Roman harpastum was borrowed from the Greeks, who also had a ball game called episkiros, pi sigma kappa upsilon rho omicron, literally, common ball. It is interesting that even FIFA recognizes this game as an early form of soccer, and the ancient Greek bas-relief, depicting an athlete with a ball on his knee, is engraved among other images on the UEFA Champions League Cup. Thus, the Roman harpastum was a variation of the ancient Greek episkiros. But we already know much more about this game. The game was played between two teams, which had from 12 to 14 people each. Players were allowed to use both feet and hands. It was a very tough game. Wrestling techniques such as grabs and throws were allowed against opposing players. Fractures, sprains, and strains were common during matches. 3 lines were drawn on a rectangular field of play, marking the boundaries and the middle of the field. The aim of the game was to make the ball cross the boundary line in the opponent's half of the field. Despite the severity of the game, it was played by both men and women, although it is possible that a lighter version of the game existed among women. The ball for the game of harpastum was made of cane. Although there were also leather balls or balls made from pig's bladder. There was no time limit in the game. The game was played as long as both teams were able to continue. There was no break, but a tired or injured player could leave the game or be replaced by a new player willing to play. It was not uncommon for there to be no players left on the field by the end of the game. Ancient Rome, the greatest state of the ancient era, had many institutions of power, many of which, at least in principle, have survived to this day. But there is one interesting fact. In Rome there was not even an approximate analogue of the city police. By the way, there were no firemen either, if we mean professionals, whose service is to fight fires. The situation was handled in proportion to one's wealth. The well-to-do often had some kind of analogy to fire departments made up of slaves. In the case of fire, the ordinary Romans had to rely only on their neighbors. It is true that there were amusing precedents. For example, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, created the first fire department of his slaves, after which he became known as a benefactor and philanthropist. In fact, his firemen immediately tore a burning house to pieces, even though it could have been saved. And then Crassus simply bought up real estate at bargain prices. But back to the crime situation. Its level in Rome at the turn of the millennium was quite high. Prior to the 1st century AD, there was no law enforcement service in the city, and everyone had to worry about their own safety. Daredevils, daring to make a night hike through the narrow and winding Roman streets, had to arm themselves or take a guard with them. The lack of lighting in the streets only made it easier for the robbers. Theft, robbery, extortion, counterfeiting of liquor and jewelry flourished in Rome. Powerful gangs could keep entire areas of the city under their control. According to Juvenal, the victim of a night attack should have been happy if he had at least a couple of teeth left. As they left home, the Romans carefully closed their shutters and locked the door. Shopkeepers additionally covered windows and doors with chains. There are many ancient Roman locks in museums which show evident traces of burglary. With malefactors tried to struggle also with the help of magic. Trade in special curse tablets flourished in the city. There are few extant records of political confrontation accompanied by a struggle between bandit groups. For example, the plebeian tribune Clodius amassed squads which he used to intimidate, pillage, and murder political opponents. One of his victims was Cicero, whose estate was looted. Belonging to the radical populists, Clodius attacked the oligarchy of the Optimates, encroaching even on Pompey, who was afraid for this reason to leave the house. Cicero's fellow optimist Milan, concentrating gladiatorial gangs around him, fought back against Clodius. At a time when Milan had solicited a consulship and Clodius a praetorship, their factions staged battles in the streets of Rome. During the reign of Augustus, Rome established a number of power structures to ensure order in peacetime. These included the Praetorian Guard, the city cohorts, and the vigiles. The latter were most similar to the modern police force. The vigiles were organized into cohorts according to the army model. Each city district was assigned its own unit. Besides ensuring public order, vigiles became firemen and were equipped with water pumps and other things needed in such cases. Each cohort was headed by a prefect, who was the police chief of the district. Initially, the vigiles recruited all comers, including foreigners and freedmen. The main prize was Roman citizenship, which a policeman received after 6 years of service. I'm not sure about the pay, but the fact remains that often an encounter with such a patrol meant no less trouble for a late traveler than for a robber. Subsequently, Emperor Tiberius undertook a radical reform of the police service, which raised its prestige dramatically. It was no longer easy to get into the police force, but the officers were much better off than the same legionnaires. The quality of work had also improved, at least when people saw a patrol in a narrow street they did not run away at the drop of a hat. The main instrument of retaliation or performance during the royal and republican periods was private revenge, in an eye for an eye, Italian, mode. Unlike in many other states, in ancient Rome the institution of private revenge was at a higher stage of development and was partly enshrined in law. Over time, attempts of the Roman authorities to switch from vengeance to fines, compositions, paid by offenders for the benefit of those affected by torts can be traced. By the time the Roman dictator and relative of the gods, Gaius Julius Caesar, left this mortal world, few in the Republic could compete with him in military glory and political capital. But Caesar did not shun earthly goods either. His entire fortune, including real estate and slaves, has not been accurately estimated, but still we can draw certain conclusions from the sources that have come down to us. To give you an idea of how large the sum Caesar operated with, I report that 1,000 sesterces in those days would have been enough for a year of life for a family of 4. The following figures should give you a sufficient idea of the fortune that Caesar acquired during his years of faithful and faithless service for the good of Rome. To Servilia the elder, a venerable lady, who incidentally was the mother of the same Brutus, Caesar presented a precious pearl worth 6 million sesterces. At the end of the Gallic War, Caesar had to sell about 10 tons of gold, which turned out to be somehow substandard. It was sold at half price, which amounted to 9 million sesterces. The father of the famous Cleopatra, Ptolemy XII, gave Caesar a small gift with which he wanted to secure the position of king. I did not misspell it. The gift cost Ptolemy almost 7 million sesterces. After his victory in the Civil War, on his return to Rome, Caesar brought with him over 400 million sesterces, in coins and jewels, a third of the entire sum belonging to him personally. The celebrations he held on his arrival cost Caesar almost 30 million sesterces, spent on endless feasts, gladiatorial shows, and other amusements that pleased the people. With his own money Caesar built a forum that cost him almost 100 million sesterces. After the famous events in the Senate on March 15, 44 B.C., his wife Calpurnia gave Mark Antony and Octavian more than 300 million sesterces, which were stored in the deceased dictator's home stash. In fulfillment of Caesar's will, Octavian Augustus gave to the city the beautiful gardens on the banks of the Tiber, which had been the private property of Gaius Julius. In addition, each Roman plebeian received 300 sesterces. I think the above facts show quite exhaustively that for a man who at the beginning of his career as a politician hid from numerous creditors, Gaius Julius Caesar eventually became quite wealthy. Of course, Caesar could not compete with his partner in the triumvirate, Marcus Licinius Crassus, but still, he managed to save something for a rainy day. If you have more facts about how much money Caesar had, I am waiting for this information in the comments. I'd love to read it. Caligula went down in history as Rome's most reckless tyrant. His pathological eccentricity and intemperance eventually ended badly for him and his family. The totality of the factors that influenced the formation of Caligula's character is a controversial issue for researchers. Here we can mention the supposed mental deviation, the bad upbringing, he was brought up among soldiers, the difficult youth involving the massacre of his kin, the bad example of Tiberius' tyranny, and the favorable political conditions for autocratic arbitrariness created by his predecessors. The beginning of Caligula's reign was quite positive. He abolished a number of existing repressive and unpopular laws, granted amnesty, abolished the sales tax and organized lavish spectacles to the delight of the plebs. However, a few months after such a benign beginning, the emperor began to execute the undesirable. In the autumn of 37 Caligula became seriously ill, presumably, with encephalitis. According to ancient authors, Caligula's personality disorder became a consequence of his long illness. According to one version, the cause of the emperor's neuropsychiatric problems was epilepsy, which he allegedly suffered from childhood. After an unsuccessful military campaign to Germany and Britain in 39–40, which ended in battle with the sea on the coast of the Pas de Calais and collecting shells as spoils of war, Caligula focused on debauchery, consolidation of his autocracy, torture and executions, including of his own relatives. If at first he tried to win favor with the senators, he subsequently carried out a veritable terror against them, harassing them in every way and sending one by one to the scaffold. The logic of the executions was more and more to show those around them that in comparison to the divine emperor they were nobody, in spite of their origin and titles. One day Caligula laughed for no reason at a feast. One of the nobles politely inquired about the reason for the laughter. "What amused me," replied Caligula, "was that if I raised an eyebrow, you would lose your head. Let them hate me, as long as they fear me." He liked to quote the tragedy of Lucius Actium. A demonstrative disregard for all norms and moral and ethical rules became Caligula's trademark. In violation of the canons, he deified himself and his sister, with whom he cohabitated, walked around in women's dresses and costumes of gods, openly practiced adultery with noble married Roman women, regularly arranged violent orgies, often preceded by torture and execution, made his horse a senator. There are many similar stories about Caligula. However, today it is difficult to distinguish which of them really took place, and which are historical anecdotes. The emperor's wastefulness led to the depletion of the treasury. To solve financial problems, Caligula imposed new predatory taxes, arranged requisitioning of pack animals, and forced his subjects to bequeath part of their property to him. The only purpose of the renewed trials for insult to grandeur was often to confiscate the property of the accused. As time passed, the reckless emperor became increasingly suspicious and unpredictable. This precipitated the preparation of a large-scale conspiracy involving 8 noble patrician families. The commander of the Praetorians Cassius Hyrieus, several centurions and a detachment of mercenaries were involved, apparently, not for free, in the assassination. On January 21, 41 they ambushed Caligula in an underground gallery on his way from the theatre to the baths and turned him into a bloody pulp. A little later, the conspirators also massacred Caligula's family, including his 1-year-old daughter. After Caligula's death, an attempt was made to restore to the Senate the importance it had lost under the emperors and restore the Republic. However, soon Claudius, a relative of Caligula, with the support of the army, came to power, put an end to the conspirators, and everything returned to normal. After performing its brief swan song, the Senate finally turned into a decorative deliberative body. Judea is a small but terribly uncomfortable country. It had been a bone in Rome's throat for more than 200 years, and much blood was spilled on both sides in the process of its conquest. In 63 B.C., the Romans invaded Palestine for the first time. At that time, the kingdom of Hasmonia controlled this territory. The kingdom was in turmoil. 2 brothers, 2 pretenders to the throne, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, could not divide the throne. In order to provide international aid to the brotherly nation, the general Gnaeus Pompey went to Jerusalem with his troops. The kingdom went to Hyrcanus, but he ceased to be king after that. The Romans gave him the title of ethnarch, national leader, in modern parlance. His state retained its self-government, but lost its independence. Antipater, a Roman protégé, became the de facto ruler. In the year 43 there was another revolt. Antipater was poisoned, and soon the Parthians came to Judea, thinking that it was a shame not to take advantage of the chaos and try to get something for themselves. They appointed a ruler of their own who promised them support. But Antipater's son Herod, the same one who would later be called the Great One, ran to the Romans for help. The triumvirs supported him, gave him troops, and in 37 BC Jerusalem was repulsed from the Parthians by allied forces, the Romans and Herod's mercenary army. After his death, Octavian Augustus followed the classic Roman principle of divide and conquer. Judea was divided into several tetrarchies. The tetrarchies changed shape and ways of governing several times. For example, from A.D. 26 to 36, Judea was governed by the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. The population periodically revolted. By the 60s the most massive of these began, directed against another Roman procurator, Hessius Florus, who demanded that the Jerusalem temple pay taxes. In 66, the Exciath Legion of Lightning finds itself under the walls of Jerusalem to put down the rebellion. It even enters the suburbs, but still the attack is repulsed. The legion retreats and is defeated in the retreat at Beth-horon, losing legion eagles. A disgrace to all of Oikumenu, for which it must be avenged. After 4 years of continuous fighting, the Romans conquer Galilee and approach Jerusalem. Titus, son of the Roman Emperor Vespasian, commands them. The siege lasts for 5 months and as a result, the angry Romans demolish the city to the ground. All that is left of the temple is a piece of wall, now the famous Wailing Wall. The victors get their triumphs, but they somehow feel sour. The vast empire has, of course, defeated a small province, but the victory came in great blood. The next rebellion happens in A.D. 115. But the main action takes place elsewhere. Jerusalem lies in ruins, the Temple Mount is plowed away, there is nothing here and nothing to fight for. In 130 AD, the Romans decide to rebuild the city as their own. Construction begins. The Temple of Jupiter appears on the site of the former Jewish temple, and a statue of Emperor Hadrian is placed on the most sacred part. The Jews rebel and take Jerusalem back from the Romans. Their greatest hope was the rebirth of the temple, but here it turns out that this is exactly what the Romans are not prepared to do. The leader of the rebellion, Bar Kokhba, tries to revive the temple and the sacrifices, minting his own coin. Many think he is the Messiah. But another Roman, Julius the North, comes and another rebellion is crushed. This time Jerusalem is not destroyed. It was simply purposefully populated by the Romans, and the Jews were forbidden even to approach it, except for 1 day a year, a prohibition that lasted until the 7th century. There were 2 main classes in ancient Rome, patricians and plebeians. The patricians were those citizens of Rome who could trace their lineage back to the first senators. The very name, patrician, comes from the Latin word patres, that is, fathers. According to a legend recounted by Plutarch, the founder of Rome himself, Romulus, singled out 100 of the best citizens and appointed them advisors. The assembly of these counselors was called the Senate, and they themselves were called the fathers of the people, the patricians. Romulus used this name to emphasize the importance of their paternal concern for the welfare of the Roman people. The plebeians originally had no political rights in Rome. This changed after a long struggle, with the plebeians ostentatiously leaving Rome for the sacred mountains outside the city limits. Or, to avoid going too far, to the Aventine Hill, which, however, was also outside the boundaries of the city of Rome at the time. Thus the plebeians showed their dissatisfaction with the one-man rule of the patricians. Their struggle was crowned with success and the posts of people's tribunes and aediles, assistant tribunes in the magistrates, were introduced. At first, the people's tribunes could formally make laws only for the plebeians, while the patricians were subordinate only to the Senate. But over time they gained equal rights and could veto the decisions of magistrates, including patrician magistrates. Already in the first written laws of Rome, the so-called Laws of the 12 Tables, equal rights were established for all Roman citizens, regardless of origin. Initially among these laws was one prohibiting marriage between plebeians and patricians, but a year later it was repealed. This was done by the people's tribune Gaius Canuleius. He also wanted to ensure that plebeians, like patricians, could become consuls. But the Senate decided otherwise. As a compromise, a new position of military tribune with consular power was introduced, to which plebeians could also be elected. And in the 3rd century BC, the wealthiest plebeian families merged with the patrician ones into a class called the nobility. Nobility means nobility in Latin. The word plebiscite also comes from ancient Rome, the name given to the decisions of plebeian assemblies, which from 287 BC became binding on all citizens, plebeians and patricians alike. Wealthy Romans joined the new class of horsemen. The patricians, however, reappeared in the 1st century. During the Principate, beginning with the reign of Octavian Augustus, the imperial nominees began to be called so. The old patrician families had by then largely been extinct, so now the patricians were appointed by the emperor. Everything was simpler with the plebeians. The noble plebeian families, which had been tracing their lineage back to ancient times, joined the nobility and then the horsemen. So did the nouveau riches, because the property qualification in the division of Roman citizens into classes during the reform of Servius Tullius made wealth, not origin, the main thing. The poor, on the other hand, formed the Roman plebs. The Romans, who had no property at all, were called proletarians. It should be remembered that besides Roman citizens, there were foreigners without Roman citizenship in the city, as well as slaves. Any plebeian could count on assistance from the Roman state, received free bread during food distributions, and had all civil rights, including suffrage. Non-citizens, women, and slaves had no such rights. A woman's status was determined before marriage by the status of her father, and after marriage by the social status of her husband. Originally, the patricians in ancient Rome were those who ruled, and the plebeians were those who were ruled. And no matter what the two classes were called afterwards, the essence remained. The patrician of the 2nd century A.D., appointed by the emperor to a high position, despite the dissimilarity of his position, origin and way of life to the patrician of the 4th century B.C., performed the same function in the Roman state. The plebs could influence legislation through the tribunes of the people, but it was always the patricians who wrote the laws. Ancient Roman women, like any women, loved to dress up. Roman fashion over the centuries changed many times, new fabrics, patterns and styles appeared. Roman emperors tried to use laws against luxury to discourage women who spent fortunes on clothes and jewelry, but nothing worked. At first clothes were made almost exclusively of wool or leather, then came linen, and with the development of trade from the East silk began to arrive. In late antiquity they were able to make very thin, translucent fabrics. We know their names: linen, sindon, amorgine and others. It was the same with colors. In the harsh republican times, when Rome was small and money was scarce, people wore mostly light wool clothes, except for a border they could dye. But the further on, the more often bright colors were used. Known as the Kos silk, silk that was made from Chinese raw materials on the island of Kos and was dyed in the color of the sea wave. The basis of women's costume was the tunic, a sort of long simple shirt, with or without sleeves. They wore it at home, and it was as indecent to show oneself outside in a tunic as in a bathrobe today. At first, the cut of the tunic was the most basic. A piece of cloth was folded in half and a hole was cut into it for the head and the sides were sewed up. The whole construction was girt and the length was adjusted by simply letting out the extra fabric over the belt. Then tunics with full sleeves and shoulder line began to appear. On the tunic was put on the full dress, table. If the tunic had long sleeves, the table could be sleeveless and looked about like a sarafan. If the tunic was sleeveless, the table was sleeved. It was in ancient Rome that sleeves with clasps were invented. It seems decent and the hands are closed, but it looks seductive. The stola was belted under the chest, above the waist. Tables were clothes of free Roman citizens, neither slaves, nor freedmen wore such clothes. Tables could be embroidered with gold threads and were almost always decorated with ornaments. The favorite ornaments of Roman women were fairly simple: stylized leaves, rhombuses, and squares. The table could be anything depending on the fashion. It was belted, decorated with frills, pearls, or embroidery. Seneca wrote, "Matrons should not wear cloths of the colors worn by saleswomen," so in his time matrons at all times tried to put on not a strict white cloth with a little purple border at the hem, and something colorful and bright. And the corrupt women had their fun as best they could. The outer garment for men and women at first was a toga, just a piece of woolen cloth, which was wrapped around them as best they could. Then the toga became the men's official clothes, like our business suit, and every wrinkle in it was regulated. And the palla became the women's garment. A palla is essentially a modern stole, a wide, long cloak that could be wrapped around you in many different ways. There were short capes with something like a hood, and there were thick woolen cape coats, panules. Tunics and tables, however, are still traditional costume and lasted until about the time of the first Caesars. In late Roman times, the most fashionable type of dress was the dalmatic, a loose tunic with wide sleeves. Dalmatic was first mentioned in the 4th century AD, and already in Byzantium it became the most common type of dress for men and women. Of course, Roman women wore jewelry. Jewelry, too, did not change much. These were earrings, bracelets, beads, sometimes graceful, sometimes rude. In later times, they could wear several rings on one finger or several earrings in the ear. Even then, the most popular were rings and bracelets in the form of snakes. Hair ornaments were especially common. The fashion for hairstyles in Rome was changing rapidly and new kinds of hairpins and tiaras were needed. In traditional Republican Rome matrons were forbidden to dye their hair, but the farther this prohibition was observed, the less. And now for the most intimate of all. Ancient Roman women knew very well what underwear was, and underneath it all, that is, under the palla, stola and tunic, or dalmatica, they wore bandages on their hips and breasts. Judging by the numerous images of girls engaged in this kind of sport, these bandages were quite comfortable and did not differ much from modern swimwear in appearance. Since all forms of carriage and package transport were forbidden in Rome for personal purposes, Romans had to move around the city mainly on foot. Taking into account that the city was rather big even by today's standards, 20 kilometers in circumference at the end of the 1st century A.D. And the configuration of Roman clothes, especially togas, did not encourage fast walking. The travel from one quarter to another could take several hours. The only mode of transport allowed, the lectica, was available only to a small number of rich and noble people. It took at least 4 slaves plus 2 or more slaves actively pushing the crowd to get the lectica moving. The slave-bearer had to have not only stamina, but also certain walking skills to carry the load not only quickly, but also gently, to avoid motion sickness. The more noble and wealthy the Roman was, the more spacious and sumptuously decorated the lectica he had. According to Juvenal, in the Hexaphra, a lectica with 6 porters, one could sleep, read or write on the road. That is, in addition to the bed there was also a cist with scrolls, tablets and writing utensils. A miniature version of the lectica were the celli, often used by noble. The common mode of transportation in the country as a whole was pack donkeys, mules, and camels. Heavier loads were transported on ox-drawn wagons. The speed of such vehicles was low, 4.5 km per hour for donkeys and camels and 3 km per hour for oxen. We know the fares for transportation in Diocletian's time, 284 to 305 cent. Donkey, 4 denarii per 100 kilometers, camel, 8, cart, 20. For comparison, the salary of a legionary was about 2 denarii a day. In view of the high cost of transport services and low carrying capacity, the cost of wheat transported 500 kilometers. In this way doubled. Transportation by water was much cheaper. So transportation by sea of 1 modium, 9 kilograms. Of goods to Rome from Alexandria, 1,900 kilometers, was estimated at 16 denarii. That is, transporting goods from one province to another on water was cheaper than transporting them for 100 kilometers. For this reason, the state had to subsidize the delivery of grain to large cities, because the trade did not recoup the costs. Water transport also had significant disadvantages. Sailing equipment of Roman cargo ships was rather primitive, so the ships could be delayed for a long time in the dead calm, storms and headwinds. Breakdowns were quite frequent, and the shipping season was only 6 months a year. With favorable conditions, it was possible to sail from Carthage, modern Tunisia, to Narbonne, coast of France, in 5 days. Today that distance is covered in 6 hours by plane. Merchant ships had an average cargo capacity of 90 tons. Under Octavian Augustus, the Roman Empire established a statium service, provided with pack horses and riding horses, as well as wagons and chariots pulled by 3 to 10 mules, for fast transportation. Heavy transport was performed by means of wagons with 2 pairs of oxen harnessed to them. Initially cursus publicus was used to transport important correspondence, later, also for transportation of valuable goods and trips of VIPs. To ensure the work of the transport service, stations were built along the roads with a distance of 15 kilometers. Large for the overnight stay and small for the change of animals. The stations contained several dozens of horses and mules, which served for 4 years each. The station staff, which included veterinarians, grooms, carpenters and blacksmiths, was made up of state slaves. They were supplied with everything they needed, but were not paid. People learned how to brew beer in ancient times. The Sumerians and Egyptians also drank it. But in ancient Greece and Rome, beer was not popular. Both Greeks and Romans preferred wine, because the climate of these countries allowed them to grow fine grapes. Nevertheless, the ancient peoples knew how to brew beer and, on occasion, could easily knock over a mug or 2. The Romans called beer ceresis. According to legend, it was the sacred drink of the goddess of the harvest, Ceres. In early Rome, with its harsh traditions and disapproval of drunkenness, a Roman citizen could drink at his leisure mainly at festivals in honor of various gods. At the harvest festival, at the end of autumn, they drank freshly brewed beer, usually pale barley beer. It is sometimes claimed, with reference to Pliny the Elder, that ancient Roman peasants in southern Italy made wheat beer, but this is incorrect. The famous Roman historian was referring to wheat gruel, not a heady beverage at all. Beer was mainly consumed by the Roman plebeians, and the enlightened Romans considered it the drink of the poor and barbarians. That is why there are almost no mentions of it in ancient Roman texts. Even legionaries preferred beer to pasca, an invigorating drink made from diluted sour wine. At the same time, beer in ancient Rome, like in Greece, was prescribed to the sick to strengthen the body. The famous physician Hippocrates even wrote a treatise about the benefits of beer. Doctors prescribed special medicinal beer made of dried malt with aromatic herbs for their patients. Another famous beer lover was Gaius Julius Caesar. Beer is a high and all-powerful drink, he wrote. Caesar was most likely addicted to beer in Gaul. Unlike the Romans, the Gauls and Celts greatly respected beer. According to Roman authors, they made beer in the following way. They dug ditches and sowed them with barley. Then they poured water into the ditches. When the barley sprouted, they built fires near the ditches. The barley would then be harvested, dried, and used to brew beer, to which, for the best effect, they sometimes added baleen, in small quantities, of course. And where could a simple Roman skip a glass of beer? In Rome there was nothing wrong with fast food. Fast food joints were called thermopolia. The city of Pompeii had about 150 thermopolies for a population of 20,000. But they did not sell alcohol. The counterparts of the bars were other institutions, popinus. Apart from wine and beer, hot food was served there. Popinus were typical hot spots with drunken brawls and all sorts of trash. They were places where you could meet anyone you wanted, from a drunken senator to a freedman. Besides poppies, the Romans also had copones. Ancient Roman taverns were called with this word and offered their clients a place to sleep besides food and drink. Copuns were located both in cities and along roads in the countryside. The signature drink of the Roman copones was the Calida. Calida is wine with spices diluted with hot water. When on the road, Roman travelers preferred to drink Calida to avoid catching dysentery. In the caupones, located in the Gallic provinces, the Celtic beer was also served, which was brewed from wheat with the addition of honey. The Roman writer Strabo also mentions millet beer, which the northern peoples drank. Tacitus wrote of the Germanic tribes who drank beer from barley or wheat. The Roman settlers who lived next to them, though they despised everything barbaric, did not refuse beer and sold it themselves in taverns. As Posidonius the Greek wrote, they diligently poured mug after mug from the same barrel, which were spread left and right by the servants. So it was possible to have a mug of beer with friends in ancient Rome as well. It so happened that initially gladiators in Rome became briefly and not of their own free will, they will inevitably die during the funeral games. The first gladiatorial games were a sacrifice to the gods, and those who survived the battles were later murdered anyway. It was only at the end of the 2nd century that the arena games ceased to be a send-off to the last journey of a respected patrician, but became a spectacle in itself. The first gladiators were prisoners of war, then by order of the Roman court they were sent to the arena. Those who were sentenced to death were generally banally killed during games. But those who were not condemned to death, but, by the sword, entered the ludus, gladiator school, and passed the path of a real gladiator. But of course, over time, there were fewer and fewer prisoners in this way, although the scale of gladiatorial games only increased. In 65 BC, Julius Caesar, as part of the election campaign, held games with the participation of 640 gladiators, after which several thousand people could take part in the show. There were many people imitating naval battles in Naumachia. Gladiators began to accept into their ranks not only prisoners and criminals, but also ordinary slaves who were bought by the owner of the ludus, that is, a lanist. Free citizens could also become gladiators. At first, there were very few of them, because it was believed that the gladiator was not just a doomed person, but he had already been sacrificed to the gods of death and was therefore not considered fully alive. They could not even be buried in an ordinary cemetery, but were usually reserved after death for separate places only for suicides, which voluntary gladiators seemed to be in the minds of respectable citizens of Rome. But as the gladiatorial games became show business, there were more and more Roman citizens willing to sign a contract with Lanista. In all cases, it does not matter how the future gladiator got into the ludus. In the first months he was considered a newt. This was the name given to newcomers, incompetents, and those who didn't know anything about being a warrior in the arena. They still needed to get used to the gladiator diet with lots of barley. It was believed that this grain is useful for the growth of muscles, but of their own free will, the Romans did not eat it. In the army they ate barley porridge as a punishment for the legionaries who were guilty in something. As the main drink, gladiators were given ash diluted in water. This alkaline drink contributed to the healing of their wounds. Whoever the gladiator had been in his previous life, he now lived in a small room behind an iron cage and was free from it only for training and food. The doors of the gladiators who became such by choice were not locked in the cell, but otherwise their home was the same as that of slaves with criminals. All of the gladiators' free time was taken up with training, and he was always immediately punished for the slightest mistake. Gladiators who refused to fight in the arena were usually ostentatiously and painfully executed in the ludus courtyard, for example, burned alive. If a person successfully completed the course of a young fighter, the gladiator received the status of gregarious. Thus, various criminal masses were designated, which were used as additional attributes for large games, during which they had to die under the sword of professionals. However, after the first battle in the arena, they received the status of a novice fighter. In the future, his gladiatorial career was determined only by one criterion: victories in duels. Not every defeat resulted in death, but the audience did not support the unlucky or cowardly gladiators. In addition to the audience's love, expressed, among other things, by various material gifts, the gladiator champions received thousands of valuable coins for each spectacular performance. Gladiators who had merit could go out into the city, no one was afraid that they would run away. They also had free time. They could relax in pubs, go about their own business, for example, get a part-time job. The assassin, who was not included in society, was a very convenient tool for solving various kinds of problems that sometimes faced respected citizens of ancient Rome. Hiring former or current gladiators was a common practice in Rome. Private gladiatorial fights, hiring bodyguards or fencing teachers were good excuses for employers. But most often, no one had any questions if someone hired one gladiator, or a dozen, or a couple of hundred. At times, the Roman state also hired gladiators to train legionnaires. An ordinary legionnaire only dared to fight in formation, and that was all that was needed to win battles. Sometimes, however, it was necessary to be able to fight one-on-one. For example, the commander's guards must have such skills. If the need arose, it was the gladiators who trained the legionnaires, since the gladiators' fighting skills were developed and tested during numerous deadly duels in Roman arenas. The approximate cost of sestertium is now $10. The value of as is $1, denarius, $20. The calculation of the ancient Roman exchange rate was made possible by analyzing the cost of the same goods on the market in ancient Rome and in modern grocery stores. The comparison took into account inflation. The main consumer product of antiquity, bread, was chosen as the product for analysis. In the 3rd century BC, the Romans had to pay 4 asses for a modium, 754 liters, of wheat grain. In the 1st century BC, during the reign of Caesar, the same modium of grain was already worth 12 asses, and a century later, 2 denarii, that is, 32 asses. In total, calculating the ancient Roman exchange rate, you can calculate that the modern $100 is equal to 5 denarii. If you find yourself in ancient Rome with such a sum in your pocket, what can you buy with this money? Those who do not endanger themselves do not acquire valuable goods. Therefore, you can take a chance and go to the camp of the Spartacus rebels. A place full of Romans freed from slavery and gladiators who left the arenas. Here they do not appreciate the loot in Roman cities and in the villas of the rich. The entire amount that you have can be exchanged for 24 liters of cheap wine. Rebels for such goods will give you many times more than you spent and pay with gold jewelry. However, strangers often turn out to be unsightly to them. In this case, you will simply be killed, and the wine will be taken away. There are also safer ways to spend your savings. You can buy real Falernian wine. Of course, for the cost of simple wine, such a product cannot be found, it will cost at least 4 times more expensive. After simple mathematical calculations, we find out that for the same amount you can buy yourself 4 to 5 liters of wine, that is, a small amphora. Yet, even when buying this product, there may be a certain risk. Forgery was no less common method of fraud than it is now. When buying elite wines, especially imported Greek and Egyptian wines, you should pay attention to the packaging. The seal on the neck should be clear and undamaged. Items of clothing and footwear were a great luxury in ancient Rome. The price of sandals was 20 denarii and above. The purchase of a toga was also not available to an ordinary citizen, in terms of either price or status. You could buy a simple linen tunic or a hat, but not both. Your savings will not be enough for a battle sword or armor either. Moreover, military weapons were not sold to foreigners. But even if you were a local, your money would only be enough for a couple of arrowheads. You definitely cannot afford Roman armor, and you could try your luck with gladiator armor and weapons, but they usually cost several tens of denarii. You could go to the Roman bathhouse for just 1 as and in some cases even free. However, masseurs and barbers had to submit a coin for their services. Spectacles were also inaccessible to foreigners, and you would not have had the opportunity to get to gladiator fights. Nevertheless, you could take your heart out and eat a hearty meal in Thermopolia, ancient Roman eateries. They were available to all customers. Lunch would cost 5 as, and a pleasant continuation of the evening with a girl, in denarius. Summing up all of the above, we can conclude that $100 is not the amount that would provide you with a comfortable existence, but at least you did not have to starve. You can find some information on the Wikipedia page that lists the Roman legions of the 3rd century AD. There are data on 45 legions formed before, and 36 legions that appeared later. There are 81 legions in total. Each of them has only 5,000 soldiers, plus 300 horsemen and 5,000 servants. In total, there are 551,000 people. As you know, the Western Roman Empire disappeared in the 5th century AD. Moreover, where did the entire Grand Roman Army go? At the time of the collapse of the Roman Empire to the west and east, part of the legions went to Constantinople, not Rome. Thus, the number of legions can be reduced by half at once. However, if the last rulers of Rome had really had about 300,000 soldiers, the empire would have continued to live in peace, without fear of any barbarian invasion. The Roman army under Emperor Trajan had almost as many men as expanded the empire's borders to Armenia and Babylon. Unfortunately, by the beginning of the 4th century AD, not much remained of Rome's former strength. The same list of legions also lists the date of each legion's demise. Some of them suffered heavy losses and were disbanded in 1 AD. In their place, other legions were created with the same number, but with different names. The maximum number of legions that existed simultaneously dates back to 212 AD, when there were 33 of them. The legions of the late empire were divided into comitates, regular units, and limitans. They were not full-fledged combat formations, but parts of the territorial defense, protecting only the areas, borders, of limes. You will notice that in the year of dissolution column, many of the first legions, before the 3rd century AD, have dates that date back to the 4th or 5th century, and many of the dates of the new legion's dissolution are referred to as unknown. During many civil wars, rebellions, and barbarian invasions over the centuries, many Roman legions disappeared without a trace. Not just because they were wiped out to the last person, it was very rare. The splintered legions disintegrated in the same way as in previous centuries, but no information about this has been preserved. In addition, after the defeat, the rebel legions were disbanded. At the same time, in the 5th century, there was another important factor directly related to the disappearance of the Roman legions without a trace. Most of them were still Roman only officially, formally. After Caracalla's decree of 212, all the inhabitants of the empire, despite their origin and even knowledge of the Latin language, were officially recognized as citizens of Rome. From now on, any barbarian lucky enough to be on the Roman side of limes could serve in the legion, not in the allied auxilia. After some time, due to the acute shortage of native Romans willing to serve in the army, any barbarian was accepted as a legionnaire, regardless of their place of residence. Only the metropolitan praetorians were Roman. The peripheral legions were mostly barbarians. A career in these units could be quick. Odoacer joined the Roman service in 470, and 6 years later commanded the super-elite guard of the emperor himself. Nevertheless, this did not seem enough to him. He forced the last ruler of the Western Roman Empire to give up the throne and proclaimed himself King of Italy. So how did this happen? Where did the Roman patriots look? Unfortunately, the patriots of Rome were everywhere but in the army. By that time, even the legions of the capital in Rome were not allied barbarians, but most of the mercenaries of German origin. All the other military units of the remnants of the empire were either barbarians or dead. For example, the usurper Constantine III drove out the Roman legions in England. They captured Gaul, but were defeated by the troops of another candidate for the throne, Jovinus. During the well-known Battle of the Catalaunian Fields, the forces of the Goths and Romans, the latter numbering about 25,000 men, confronted the Huns. But in fact, in the army of the last Roman, Flavius Aetius, there were only Roman commanders. For example, the front line of Roman troops consisted of Franks. After the capital was sacked by Vandals, all the warring Roman units went to Ravenna, where the emperor's court was located. In 476, Ravenna was attacked by German mercenaries of Odoacer. Some of the Romans went over to his service, the rest went home. The empire had ceased to exist, and the legions were gone. We think of Roman gladiators as formidable fighters, models of masculinity and indomitable military spirit. This attractive and popular image has continued to stir the imagination for centuries. In modern times it has migrated from history to fiction, enriching the fiction along the way and losing much of its authenticity. For example, not everyone knows that gladiators did not choose the weapons they wanted for themselves, but were divided into specialties according to the type of weapons. Let's take a look at who fought in the arena of death in ancient Rome. Bestiaries were designed to fight against beasts of prey. In the beginning, they were criminals sentenced to death, in fact, given to the predators to devour. Armed with only a spear, they went out against lions and tigers. And, as it was intended, they died. But not always. And over time, much has changed. The bestiary began to undergo special training, armed with sword and shield, and fought the beasts for money. Venators were tamers of beasts and magicians of the ancient arena. Armed only with a pair of throwing lances, they mainly showed all sorts of tricks for the entertainment of the audience, for example, juggling snakes or subduing lions. The hoplomachs were some of the most heavily armed gladiators. They were armed with a spear, a small shield, a dagger, a wrist brace on the right arm and a helmet with a visor. They were often used against more than one gladiator, their equipment allowed. They were equipped with chain mail and 2 daggers or short curved swords. Naturally, having neither a shield nor a long weapon, they had to twist around the enemy, relying on their skill and prowess. Daimahers were very dangerous. There were also gladiators who did not fight to the death, such as legniarii, fighters armed with a whip or staff. Their task was to stun the enemy. They could also hold a metal whip that could break the bones of heavy gladiators as well as big animals. Myrmilons were armed with oval shields and swords, gladiuses. On their heads they wore a massive helmet with a crest in the form of a stylized fish. They were originally called Gauls because that was the armament with which captive Gaulish warriors entered the arena. Usually they were released against the retiarii, such a fight symbolized fishing. The retiarii had a net to cast on their enemies and a trident to finish off their entangled opponent. They also had a small dagger in reserve, which they certainly did not leave behind. That said, they wore almost no armor. It was not the most respected specialty, but it was also one of the most common. More often than not, the retiarius fought against the retiarius was the securus, a heavy fighter with a rounded helmet, armed with a sword gladius and covered by a large shield. A poorly defended retiarius could only be saved by his great mobility. The most dangerous were the scissors, single gladiators who carried a gladius in one hand and a scissor, a special attachment with a semicircular blade, in the other. Such weapons inflicted shallow but profusely bleeding wounds. Another heavy fighter was a Thracian. They were armed as real Thracian warriors, a massive helmet, a heavy shield and a Thracian curved sword. By the way, the famous Roman leader of the rebel slave Spartacus was a Thracian both by nationality and by gladiatorial profession. There were also equestrians among the gladiators. Equestrians were mounted, lightly armed gladiators who could throw a spear at an opponent and then had to dismount and fight on foot. They carried a light shield and gladius. Sagittarius mounted archers were among the few who had access to long-range combat in the arena, but their participation in combat required great caution. Deadly arrows could fly outside the arena. The Romans were also fond of sea battles on artificial bodies of water. They involved naumachierii armed with short swords, boarding hooks and had a heavy spear for a single precise throw. Sometimes the ships were set on fire for show. In this case the Navmachiarians had heavy jugs of water, which also served as weapons in close combat. Of course, there were many more types of gladiators and their composition changed over the centuries, but in general the tradition that divided the heroes of the arena into classes remained. The closest counterpart to the toga is the Indian sari. It's also a huge piece of fabric, up to 6 meters long, in which you have to wrap yourself beautifully. If you don't know how, it won't work. Only the toga is even more complicated. It's not a rectangular piece of fabric, but a long semicircle, made from heavier, woolen fabrics and specially laid in beautiful, wide folds. Originally, togas were worn by everyone in Rome, including women and children. But in the most ancient times in Rome and the rules did not exist, wrap up as you want, and pieces of fabric were chosen not long. But by the time of classical Rome, by the 1st century B.C., it turned out that toga was only a man's official clothing, an approximate analog of today's business suit with a tie to match. The toga was the distinction between a true Roman citizen and all sorts of slaves and mere outsiders dressed in some kind of chitons and tunics. Emperor Augustus officially prescribed the dress code: if you want to go to a forum, wear a toga. The toga became a symbol of the citizen of the capital. Provincial officials wore them, of course, but mostly on major holidays, and they served as objects of satire. The famous Juvenal denounced them, but only Roman citizens in the capital wore togas on a daily basis. If a Roman went into exile, he was automatically deprived of the right to a toga. However, an ordinary man would not have wound it on himself. Just as ladies of the 19th century needed maids to put on a corset and crinoline, so the Roman needed a special slave, the vestillarius, to wrap Roman men in togas. It was a whole profession that had to be trained. In the absence of irons and steamers, it was a difficult task to arrange the woolen cloth in beautiful folds so that it would hold up all the time while the master made speeches in the Senate. The folds were fastened with special clips, and the toga was hung on special hangers to hold the folds. There were different togas. The usual everyday toga was white, like a black suit nowadays. Another version of a snow-white toga, and here I come out in a dazzling white suit, was the toga candida, the toga of a candidate for office. Well, yes, it must be spotless. The color purple was of particular importance. Triumphants wore purple togas embroidered in gold. For boys, togas with a red fringe were used because legend has it that the first king of Rome, Tarquinius, at the age of 14, dyed his clothes with the blood of his first enemy. So here the red border is a sort of pioneer tie for young Romans. However, the red fringe was the sign of the higher aristocracy and officials. Kites in togas, Apuleius called the officials. In Petronius the rich man Trimalchio was wearing a toga with a purple border, and he was going to be buried in it. Cicero denounced the hipsters of his day, wrapped in whole sails, not togas. Apparently, in his day, the longer and wider the clothes, the more fashionable they were. The most fashionable were considered not woolen but silk togas. Silk was valued by weight of gold, and one toga could cost a fortune. There were mourning togas, black or gray. Perhaps in the absence of modern bleaching agents, this category was gradually replaced by the usual everyday white ones. There were even yellow ones, again with a red border, especially for the augur priests. Gradually togas went out of fashion, and by the time of the fall of Rome even emperors did not wear them. But one way or another, this garment remained one of the symbols of ancient Rome. In the 4th century AD the Roman Empire was divided into two virtually independent states, the Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital in Byzantium, and the Western Empire, with its capital in Rome. What was the reason for the division? This video is about that. The 3rd century AD was a difficult century for Rome. The empire was shaken by internecine wars and separatist sentiments in the border provinces. This period went down in history as the crisis of the 3rd century. By the end of the century Diocletian had succeeded in gathering together the state that had begun to disintegrate, and for almost 100 years the empire was more or less stable. But the tendency toward secession of the eastern part was growing. So, in 330, Constantine the Great, the one who made Christianity the state religion, moved the capital from Rome to Byzantium. This was done to ensure the stability of power, as in Byzantium, he was the sole ruler, away from the intrigues and conspiracies of the Palace of Rome. Constantine's descendants divided the empire among themselves and ruled separately the western and eastern parts, although formally the Roman Empire remained a single state. At the same time, from time to time, one or another emperor united both parts of the empire under a single administration. The last emperor who ruled both parts of the empire was Theodosius the Great. After the death of Theodosius, the parts of the empire were ruled by his sons. In the west the youngest was Honorius, and in the east the eldest was Flavius Arcadius. Thus the division of the empire was finalized. But it would be strange to think that the only reason for the division was the desire of each of the heirs to have a part of the empire in management. The reasons were both managerial and socio-economic. Difficulties of governance. The Roman Empire by the 4th century was very large. For example, it took about 40 days for a messenger to travel from the border with Parthia to Rome and 38 days from Londinium. At the same time there was constant turmoil on the borders. With such a slow transmission of information, it was impossible to effectively manage and respond to military threats. Large garrisons had to be held along the entire length of the borders, putting too much power in the hands of the warlords. The division of the empire was a compromise. The two empires were roughly equal in strength and close culturally, so a direct clash was unlikely, while at the same time the emperors could engage in more effective governance on a smaller scale. Economic causes. In addition, the economic gap between East and West was growing. During the 2nd century, the Roman Empire flourished and experienced a tremendous economic boom. This was primarily because the imperial government gave more freedom to the provinces and ended the practice of spontaneous expropriations that had been widespread since the time of Marius and Sulla. The economy was also boosted by a long period of peace. The strongest growth was in the eastern part of the empire, in what is now Greece, Turkey, and the Near East. These lands were highly urbanized and trade flourished in them, helped by the fact that many trade routes passed through them. The West also experienced an economic boom, but to a much lesser extent. The economy of the western part of the empire was for the most part agrarian. The economy in those days was very different from that of today. It was hard to get rich trading large quantities of consumer goods, but it was easy to get rich trading small quantities of luxury goods, silk, jewelry, porcelain, spices, etc. That is why the East grew rich much faster. When hard times came, the crisis of the 3rd century, it was only natural that in the richer East, separatist sentiments arose. Indeed, why should the wealthy East suffer because of palace intrigues in Rome? In an attempt to unify the empire, Diocletian, more warrior than politician, imposed strict centralized control of the economy and an aggressive system of taxation. Unfortunately, his actions only exacerbated the differences between East and West. Diocletian's taxes were the greatest burden on the urbanized and densely populated East, while in the more agrarian western part of the empire farmers found many ways and tricks to avoid taxes. Thus the formal reason for the division of Rome was to solve the problem of governing vast territories, but even if not, this division was probably still inevitable because of the social and economic contradictions between the rich mercantile East and the poor agrarian West. Alexander the Great had an uncle, he is also a son-in-law and at the same time a namesake, Alexander I of Molos, and Epirus since 350 B. He was the brother of Olympias, the wife of Basilius Philip II of Macedonia, and he himself married Cleopatra, his daughter. Philip helped him become the ruler of the Greek state of Epirus, neighboring Macedonia. In 334 BC Alexander the Great went on a campaign against the Persians, at the same time Alexander of Epirus sailed to fight in the west, in Italy. The uncle of the great conqueror with his army went to war for a reason, but fulfilling an allied duty to the Greek cities located in the south of the Italian peninsula. The inhabitants of Tarentum called him to help them against the overpowering Messapes and Lucanians, the Italian tribes who lived in Brutia and Lucania. Uncle and nephew corresponded with each other, bragging about their successes. A year later, Alexander the Great won a brilliant victory in the Battle of Issus. The Persian army was defeated, King Darius had to flee with the pitiful remnants of the army. It is believed that out of the hundreds of thousands of Persian soldiers who came to Issa, only 4,000 left with Darius. Alexander of Epirus defeated the Italians at the same time, but his nephew disparagingly called his war a mouse fuss. My uncle objected that here he was fighting against men, but young Alexander the Great was fighting with effeminate Persians. 2 years later, his uncle was ambushed and killed by treacherous Lucans. It would seem that this is a wonderful reason for the great conqueror to turn west, land in Italy and capture it all, along with Rome. What stopped him? By that time Alexander had conquered Egypt and moved to Mesopotamia, where his old enemy Darius was assembling a new army. He could not and did not want to be distracted, because Persia was the main goal of his campaign. Even if he adored his uncle and was burning with a thirst for revenge, Italy could wait for the final solution of the Persian question. Persia has threatened the Greeks since time immemorial, and the war with it was perceived as a sacred duty. And the minor showdowns of the Greek colonists in Italy with some natives did not bother the Macedonians. In Persia, it was possible to capture very large prey. Alexander had already robbed the richest cities of Phoenicia and Egypt. His friends and associates had become rich people and were going to become even richer. Untold treasures awaited them in Persia. But the Italian tribes, by the standards of the civilized countries of antiquity, were poor. It was not at all interesting for the Greeks to conquer them, even after the complete occupation of the Persian lands. Whether it's India, though distant, but, according to rumors, living in fabulous luxury. That's where Alexander's army headed for. But upon the return of Alexander the Great from the Indian campaign, wouldn't he want to conquer the Western countries? He wanted to, and, apparently, was actively preparing for this. But the next irresistible blow of his army was aimed not at Italy at all, but at Carthage. The reason was still the same: the Punians were famous for their wealth. Besides, the conquest of Carthage made it possible to control the sea routes in the western part of the Mediterranean Sea. Since the eastern ports already belonged to Alexander, the empire would profit from all maritime trade in the region. If Alexander had lived even longer, then upon the conquest of Carthage, he could have aimed at the last goal worthy of his attention, the Etruscan 12. After all, the Etruscans were also not poor people. Besides, their fleet competed on equal terms with the Carthaginian and Greek. The conquest of the Etruscan polis would put the final point in the construction of Alexander's vast empire, mighty and indestructible. The Greek polis of southern Italy would have joined it without a fight. That's when the Macedonian generals could get their hands on other Italian nationalities, including Latins in general and Romans in particular. Since the Italians were a constant threat to the southern polis, they had to be dealt with once and for all. However, Alexander died much earlier and he simply did not reach Rome. Marcus Junius Brutus was very fond of praise. Even before receiving official titles, he was already awarded the honorary title of Princeps Juventutis, first of the young, for his oratory. Luck was practically his trademark. In the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, he fought on the side of the latter, but after Caesar's victory, the latter was still able to win his favor and even love. Just 5 years later, Brutus received the post of praetor, and 3 years later he was to become consul, that is, the highest official of the Republic. But something still separated Marcus Junius Brutus from the long-awaited promotion. The Uni family was famous for its centuries-old struggle against tyranny. Its founder was considered to be Lucius Junius Brutus, who participated in the overthrow of the last Roman king Tarquinius the Proud. In 493 BC, one of the Junii became a member of the first collegium of people's tribunes. Brutus' maternal ancestor was Gaius Servilius Agula, who in 439 BC killed the rich man Spurius Maelius, who allegedly wanted to become king of Rome. Junius Brutus was keenly interested in the history of his family and wanted to one day repeat the feat of his ancestors, killing some tyrant. But where is this tyrant to be found? However, Brutus had friends who opened his eyes to the nature of his benefactor, Julius Caesar. Look, they said, first Caesar was given dictatorial powers for only 11 days, this was in 49 BC, then for 10 years, and now he is a dictator for life. Instead of being re-elected every year, Julius Caesar became permanent consul for 10 years. And does he want to give up power after 10 years? He already thinks of himself as a deity and has set up a statue of himself in the temple of Quirinus, in the midst of the gods. Don't you see, Brutus, that Caesar is already a Roman king, except that he doesn't have a crown on his head? Marcus Tullius Cicero himself, the greatest orator of his time, persuaded Marcus Junius Brutus to kill Caesar. Nevertheless, Brutus was needed by the conspirators only as a living personification of the struggle against tyranny. The real organization of the conspiracy fell on the shoulders of the less noticeable Gaius Cassius Longinus. He, too, fought against Caesar on the side of Pompey and, like Brutus, was pardoned by the victor after the defeat of his leader. Cassius was a plebeian, but very influential representatives of his family from the 3rd century BC. Repeatedly became consuls. The most daring and decisive of the conspirators was the tribune of the people, Publius Servilius Casca. It was he who struck Caesar the first blow with the dagger. Participation in the murder of the dictator of such personalities as the people's tribune Casca and the hereditary fighter against tyranny Brutus was necessary for propaganda purposes, creating the right image in the eyes of the people. But the attack on Caesar was carried out by more than 20 senators, and 60 people participated in the plot itself. There were no proletarians among them. The conspirators came from the noblest Roman families. What was it that united these people and caused them to desecrate with blood the sacred walls of the Curia Pompei on the Ides of March 44 BC? Caesar was repeatedly warned about the danger, but each time he refused to guard. Was he really that frivolous? No, it's just that, unfortunately, Julius Caesar did not count on the swords of the guards, but on popular love. Although it wasn't completely groundless. The vast majority of the Romans supported Caesar. The army adored him and was ready to tear to pieces anyone who dared to threaten their beloved commander. In addition, the only social stratum that genuinely hated the dictator were the oligarchs, but Caesar did not see them as a threat. Meanwhile, Julius Caesar gradually concentrated power in his own hands. He could, of his own free will, remove from the election of magistrates those candidates whom he considered empty demagogues. He increased the size of the Senate to 900 people, and many of the newly elected senators were from Gaul, that is, by Roman standards, provincials and savages. Of course, the new senators were the perfect tool in the ruler's hands and obediently voted for any laws proposed by Caesar. However, often the dictator did not need the support of the Senate at all. He could act without its approval and issued decrees, falsifying the approval of the Senate later. The old political elite of the Republic was not at all happy with such a decrease in the importance and influence of the Roman Senate. However, they had no one to support them, because both the people and the army were on Caesar's side. Realizing that it would not be possible to overthrow the emperor legally, the old experienced politicians recruited hot-headed youngsters who were supposed to take on the sacred mission of ridding the motherland of tyranny. Moreover, most likely, even if Caesar had listened to well-wishers and increased security, it would not have helped him. The dictator's ardent haters were so convinced that Caesar was the greatest enemy of the empire that they would have gone through with it even at the cost of their own lives. The very word hygiene is of ancient Greek origin. Hygeia is the daughter of Asclepius, the patron god of medicine. The modern medical emblem with bowl and snake also comes from ancient Greece. The snake coiled around the staff, caduceus, was considered an attribute and symbol of Asclepius, and Hygeia was depicted feeding the snake from a bowl. The ancient Romans borrowed much from the ancient Greeks, including Asclepius, whom they called Aesculapius. Greek doctors were considered the best, and the richest Romans invited them to their homes as attending physicians. Roman physicians learned from the treatises of the great Greek healer Hippocrates, who lived in the 4th century BC. Also from the Greeks, the Romans adopted a beautiful habit that was considered necessary for maintaining health, the desire for bodily purity. Wherever new Roman colonies appeared, aqueducts, water supply channels, were built in them. The Romans tried to install water intakes in the mountains so that the water for drinking and washing was the cleanest. In every Roman town and even village, thermal baths were built, many of them at public expense. As already mentioned above, one of the most affordable pleasures in ancient Rome is cheap or even free baths. And here's why each subsequent emperor tried to surpass his predecessors. The baths in the capital became more and more chic. They provided visitors with many other services in addition to washing. The Roman authorities subsidized the baths, so the visitor was charged only one small coin. The imperial baths were free of charge. But for additional services, such as fashionable haircuts and various spa treatments, it was necessary to pay specialists who worked in the same thermal baths. The Romans believed that a clean-shaven face distinguished a civilized man from a shaggy barbarian, so the services of barbers were popular. In addition, they tried to get rid of hair all over the body, for which experienced artisans used tools such as pumice stone and wax. Water from the thermal baths before entering the city sewer system passed under public toilets, washing away sewage. Also, the Romans took care not only about the cleanliness of the water, but also of the streets. Horse-drawn transport at that time was the only alternative to walking. Of course, horses left surprises behind, and so that the streets were not covered with manure, special city slaves cleaned it. This fertilizer was then sold to farmers, which brought the city additional profit. And so that the dung piles did not have to be left to the people themselves, in the nooks and crannies of ancient Roman streets there were latrines and urine vessels. The Romans also knew about the benefits of washing their hands before a meal. To do this, a special bowl of water was placed in front of each guest. The Romans were so clean that they even washed their feet when they entered the house after a long walk. It would seem that with this level of hygiene, the Romans should have suffered from infectious diseases and parasites to a much lesser extent than the barbarian peoples. Recently, scientists found out that in reality not everything was so rosy at all. British scientist Piers Mitchell from the Department of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of Cambridge has carefully studied biological materials from Roman settlements in York. And I found in them even more parasites inherent in the human body than in the barbarian peoples of that time. The Romans suffered from roundworms and dysentery amoeba, as well as fish tapeworm. The latter is to blame for the love of the ancient Romans for garum sauce, which was prepared from fermented fish entrails that were not subjected to heat treatment. In ancient Roman public latrines, there was no paper. In that era, either very expensive parchment was used for writing, or papyrus imported from Egypt, which cost no less. For everyday records, wooden tablets filled with wax were used. In the restrooms, they were wiped with a special sponge on a stick. After that, it was dipped in water to wash off the sewage and reused. This only created an increased risk of contracting dysentery and other intestinal diseases. The Romans knew nothing about germs and how they spread, so the latrines in their homes could stand right in the middle of the kitchen, because there was water flowing there that could be used for flushing. And in the thermal baths, the water in the pools was rarely changed, so the patients who washed in them could infect the healthy ones. In Roman cemeteries, there are often tombstones of people who did not live to be 40 years old. The reason for this was not only frequent wars, but also numerous diseases associated with infection with various infections that the ancient Romans suffered from. What if Alexander the Great had not died of illness on June 13, 323 BC in Babylon? Surely he would have undertaken new campaigns of conquest, including those to the west. How would world history have turned out in such a case? This question is asked not only by modern fans of alternative history. Even in antiquity this theme was used for school exercises in rhetoric, and the greatest Roman historian Titus Livius devoted several pages of his work to it. Unlike the Roman patriot Livy, who predicted the great Macedonian imminent defeat at the hands of the proud sons of Romulus, modern historians are more inclined to give the palm of primacy to Alexander. Let us try to imagine in whose direction the scales would have tipped. If Alexander had planned to undertake a western campaign and conquer Italy, Sicily, and Carthage in North Africa, how would he proceed, where would he start? Fortunately, we have a clue in the form of the story Plutarch tells in his biography of Pyrrhus. It is about the famous conversation between the king and his friend Cineas, who tried to dissuade Pyrrhus from his planned adventure. "They say," said Cineas, "that the Romans are a valiant people, and in addition, they are subject to many warlike tribes. If the god will send us a victory over them, what will it give us?" Pyrrhus answered, "You, Cineas, ask about things that are self-evident. If we defeat the Romans, then no barbarian or Greek city in Italy will not be able to resist us, and we will quickly take possession of the entire country, and who but you know how vast, rich and strong it is." After waiting a little while, Cineas continued, "And what shall we do, king, when we take possession of Italy?" Pyrrhus replied, "Very near lies Sicily, a flourishing and crowded island. It stretches out its arms to us, and to take it is worth nothing, because now, after the death of Agathocles, there is all engulfed in rebellion and in the cities of lawlessness and riotous leaders of the crowd." "Well, that's fair enough," continued Kinsey. "So, taking Sicily, we will end the campaign." But Pyrrhus objected, "If God send us success and victory, it will only be the beginning of great things. How can we not go to Africa, to Carthage, if they are within easy reach? And if we seize them, no enemy, now insulting us, will be able to resist us, will it not?" It is not known whether this dialogue between the king and his crony actually took place, or whether its author was some Epicurean philosopher who urged the powerful of this world to be content with the happiness of today. What is important is that in general terms it corresponds to the main milestones of Pyrrhus' Italian campaign in 280 to 275 BC. As is well known, he was invited to Italy by the Tarentines, who feared the expansion of Rome's power. In 280 BC the king with an army of 25,000 inflicted a heavy defeat on the Romans at Heraclea, and the following year, at Ascula. Both victories cost Pyrrhus heavy losses, so he tried to make peace with the enemy on favorable terms. In 278 BC the commander went from Italy to Sicily, defeated here Carthaginians, subdued almost the entire island and deployed extensive preparations for the African campaign, but in its midst was forced to return to Italy, where the Romans again went on the offensive. Most likely, Alexander, acting 40 years earlier, would have done the same. After the death of Alexander of Epirus in 331 BC throughout southern Italy again escalated conflicts, war broke out all against all. It is unlikely, and in this atmosphere, he would have had to wait long for a convenient reason to intervene. With the support of the Greek population of Italy, owning ports convenient for landing on the sea coast, possessing virtually inexhaustible human and financial resources, Alexander could conduct military operations on the widest scale, without being constrained by any restrictions. He would have had at his disposal the strongest army of the time under the command of the best commander of all time. All his commanders, as well as many officers and soldiers, had experience of the Persian campaign. The rich agricultural regions of the southern peninsula would serve as his supply base. Food and other resources could be brought in by sea if necessary. Comparing Alexander to Pyrrhus, Livy writes that only one defeat would have sufficed to make all his endeavors fail. However, it is likely that his opponents would not have had such a chance. An important difference would have been that Alexander's adversary in Italy would not have been Rome, but the Lucanians, Japigs, Messapians, and other peoples of Apulia who threatened the Greek cities of the coast in the late 4th century BCE. The Messapi, Yapigi, Pucidi, and Longini were descendants of the Illyrians who had migrated to Italy from the Balkan Peninsula at the end of the 2nd millennium B.C. The Lucani were a southern branch of the Osco-Umbrian language group, related to the Sabines and Samnites who lived in central Italy. They came here in the 6th to 5th centuries B.C. and became a troublesome and dangerous neighbor of the Greek Tarenta, Furia, Metapontus, Heraclea, and other cities. To fight them the Greeks in 343 to 338 BC invited the Spartan king Archidamus III, and after his death in 334 BC turned for help to the king Alexander of Epirus. The latter was the brother of Olympias and, therefore, came to Alexander the Great's maternal uncle. The relatives were jealous of each other's successes. Having received news of his uncle's victories over Messapi and Lucani, Alexander, who had just defeated Darius III at Issa, disparagingly called them mouse fiddling. The king of Epirus parried by saying that he had to fight here with men, while Alexander in Persia fought with women. It is not known how it would have ended, if Alexander of Epirus did not get into an ambush Lucans near Pandosia and did not die in 331 BC. For a long time the Greeks did not know about Rome and its military successes. Only victories over the Samnites during the wars of 326 to 304 and 298 to 290 BC made the Romans known in southern Italy as well as beyond. In 291 BC they brought out the colony of Venusia, which was located on the border of Samnium, Lucania and Apulia. Soon afterward, the Greek furies appealed to Rome for protection against Lucanian attacks. The Romans tried to settle the matter, first diplomatically and then militarily. In 282 BC the consul Gaius Fabricius Luscinus defeated the Lucanians in a great battle, and then placed Roman garrisons in Heraclea, Locre, and Regia. His actions aroused the fears of Tarentum, who in 280 BC turned to Pyrrhus for help. Thus, the geopolitical reality that Pyrrhus, who landed in Italy, had to deal with did not exist 40 years earlier. What's more, between 326 and 304 BC, Rome was involved in a war against the Samnites, who were at that time the closest relatives and friends of the Lucanians. Paradoxically, in the enemy of my enemy paradigm, if Alexander appeared in Italy at this time, Rome had a better chance of being among his allies than of becoming his enemy. It is no coincidence that historians attributed the first attempt to negotiate with the Romans to Alexander of Epirus. However, his early death brought his achievements to naught. Titus Livius devotes quite a lot of space to the purely military aspect of the problem. With what troops would Alexander cross into Italy? What could the Roman Republic oppose the Macedonian phalanx? It remains to compare the forces of both sides in terms of numbers and types of troops and sources of replenishment, writes the Roman author. Judging by the censuses of the time, the population of Rome numbered 250,000 people. Thus, even with the treason of all the allies of the Latin tribe, 10 legions gave a recruitment from the inhabitants of Rome alone. That is 50,000 men. Besides, the whole of Latium with the Sabinians, Volscians, and Equi, the whole of Campania and part of Umbria and Etruria, as well as the Picenians, Marsians, Peligni, Vestines, and Apulians, together with the whole coast of the lower sea, inhabited by Greeks from Furies and up to Naples and Cumae, and thence the whole interval from Antium and Ostia. All these lands would prove either powerful allies of Rome, or her defeated adversaries. Alexander himself could transport to Italy no more than 30,000 Macedonian veterans and 4,000 horsemen, mostly Thessalians, for this was his main force. Add to them Persians, Indians, and other nations, and he would have brought with him a hindrance rather than a help. Add to this that the Romans had replenishment at home, at hand, and Alexander, waging war in a foreign land, the army would gradually become thinner, as happened later with Hannibal. Probably, in estimating the size of the Macedonian army, Livy took as a basis the size of Alexander's army, with which he went on a campaign against Persia. However, in the wars of the Diadochi, which began after the death of the king, much larger military contingents, from Macedonia, Greece, the countries of Asia, took part. With the people, apparently, there were no problems then. The demographic picture in the eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East was on the rise. So I would venture to guess that Alexander would probably have come out against Rome with a more impressive force. It is also known that before his death, the Macedonian king paid great attention to the preparation of Persian and other eastern troops, trying to rebuild them according to Macedonian molds. There was even a new fighting unit, the Antitagma. And these Asians, of whom Livy writes so contemptuously, would probably not have come to Italy as whipping boys. And, in addition, we must not forget the high fighting qualities of Persian and other Eastern cavalry. Subsequently, in the wars with the Parthians, and then with the Sassanids, the Romans were able to experience its power. Alexander also had elephants. Further, Titus Livius tells about the armament of the Macedonian and Roman warrior, tries to show the advantage of the pilum over the sarissa, the Roman oblong shield over the Macedonian round shield, the maniple over the phalanx. The Macedonians were armed with a round shield and a sarissa. The Romans had an oblong shield, better protecting the body, and a dart, striking harder from the fly than a spear. Both troops consisted of heavily armed and observed the rows, but if the phalanx of Macedonians untidy and homogeneous, the Roman military order is mobile because composed of many parts and can, if necessary, without difficulty in disconnect and again close. And on the fighting qualities of the Roman, they say, was superior to his Macedonian opponent. And who could compare with the Roman soldier in diligence, who, like him, could endure hardships? It was enough for Alexander to suffer one defeat, and he would have lost the whole war. But what battle could have broken the Romans, who had not been crushed by either Cavdius or Cannae? And even if the beginning of the campaign was successful, still more than once would have to Alexander, remembering the Persians, Indians and humble Asia, to admit that so far he has had to fight with women. Of course, Livy was a Roman patriot, and he could not allow even a hint of Macedonian victory. Hence such a biased assessment. Roman historian does not say a word about the tactical genius of Alexander, allowing him time after time to outplay the numerically superior opponent, and his opponents were not at all women, as Livy puts it. Telling about the phalanx, the historian omits the heavy Macedonian cavalry, Hetaira, which repeatedly became the main argument of the Macedonian king on the battlefield. Suffice it to recall the Battle of Gavgamela. Finally, extolling the resilience and diligence of the Romans, able to win the war even after a catastrophically lost battle, the historian denies this to the Macedonians. Yes, Alexander did not have his Cannae, no one managed to organize them for him. But his guys with long spears in the hardest campaigns in Central Asia and especially in India showed no less fortitude, diligence and heroism than the Romans. The son of Caesar and Cleopatra was called Caesarion, which meant Little Caesar, and the boy's full official name was Ptolemy 15 Philopator Philometor Caesar. Moreover, the very first name, Ptolemy, he received as the heir to the dynasty of the same name. Formally, at the time of his birth, his mother was married to her own brother Ptolemy 14. Caesarion's name alone suggests the ambiguity of his position. On the one hand, he is a legitimate representative of the dynasty of the Hellenistic rulers of Egypt, the Ptolemies. On the other hand, he is the son of Caesar, that is, the half-brother of Octavian Augustus, who was posthumously, by will, adopted by Gaius Julius Caesar. If desired, Caesarion could claim the throne of two great powers, Egypt and Rome. Rome was still a republic, of course, but soon Octavian would be the first emperor. Theoretically, together with it, or instead of it, Caesarion could have ruled. But his mother was not well liked in Rome or Egypt. During Caesar's lifetime, the Romans courted the queen who had come from Egypt and sought her protection. Immediately after the murder of her lover, Cleopatra had to immediately leave the capital. The mildest of the epithets bestowed on her by the evil-tongued Roman plebs at the time was Egyptian witch. But even at home, the queen was not very friendly, for the Egyptians she was a Roman litter and a traitor. After all, Cleopatra, in order for the Romans to support her claim to the throne of Egypt, recognized the huge debt of her country to Rome, and its payment became a heavy burden for the Egyptian treasury. Shortly upon Cleopatra's return to Alexandria, her brother, husband and co-ruler Ptolemy XIV, died. The Egyptians had no doubt that Cleopatra had poisoned him. The following year, the Nile did not flood, the fields were left without silt and suffered from drought. A year later, it all happened again. Of course, Cleopatra was also blamed for these troubles. Caesar left 3 Roman legions in Egypt to maintain order. After Caesar's death, they began to commit outrages, considering Egypt not so much an allied as an occupied country. With great difficulty, they were sent back to Rome. And in the 3rd year, the army of Mark Antony appeared in Cilicia, neighboring Egypt. Cleopatra learned that a Roman politician wanted to summon her for trial and show execution. She went to him on a gorgeous gilded ship with musicians and half-naked maids. She herself sat in the center, as ancient authors write, in the dress of Aphrodite. Mark Antony was impressed and invited her to a friendly dinner. He ended up falling in love with her. The happy couple lived together for 11 years, after losing the civil war, Antony threw himself on the sword on August 1, and Cleopatra was poisoned on August 12, 30 BC. Caesar Ion was 17 years old at the time of his mother's death. Mark Antony, who had publicly expressed doubts about Caesar's paternity after Caesar's death, changed his mind after meeting Cleopatra and began using the boy for political propaganda. His alliance with Caesarion's mother allowed him to claim that he was fighting for the rights of Julius Caesar's true heir. But for Octavian Augustus, young Caesar Ion became a direct competitor. After the victory of Octavian in the war with Mark Antony, Caesar Ion, who was not supported by anyone in Rome or Egypt, was doomed. Cleopatra understood this and sent her son to India before she died. She assigned Caesar Ion to his mentor Rawdon to keep an eye on him. But he persuaded the boy to return to Alexandria. And, unfortunately, he sent him to his death. It is not known whether Rawdon sincerely believed that Octavian would feel sorry for Caesar Ion, or whether, knowing the consequences, she deliberately made such a choice, since he was well paid for it. In any case, Octavian Augustus, who became the sole ruler of Rome, chose not to leave another son of Caesar alive and executed Caesar Ion.
It's a scientific fact that not only male gladiators met in deadly duels in the arena of the Colosseum. This is a scientific fact. It's also confirmed by the texts of Roman laws and archaeologists' findings.
In 11 AD, the Roman Senate officially forbade free women under 20 years old to enter the arena by a special decree.
And in the 19th year, there were additions to this decree. Roman senators forbade both men and women from the upper classes, senators and horsemen, to participate in gladiatorial games.
For other Roman women, not to mention slaves, there were not such restrictions.
The participation of women as fighters in the arena is demonstrated, for example, by a marble bas-relief from Halicarnassus depicting two female gladiators in heavy armor. Their names, inscribed beneath the figure of the fighters, have been preserved. Their names were Amazonia and Achilia.
The Roman author Petronius the Obiter in his Satyricon even mentioned a female escudera. This is a very specific kind of gladiator. The Acidurians were armed with bows and arrows and fought in chariots. It is believed that these gladiators were first introduced into the arena battles by Julius Caesar himself. The Roman historian Tacitus wrote that in 63 AD, a large number of noble women sullied themselves by entering the arena. As we can see, the decrees of Senate were not always respected by noble Roman women. However, there were many more ignorant townswomen who participated in such games.
Another Roman historian, Dies Cassius, has a description of gladiatorial games during the reign of Emperor Tatius Flavius Vespasianus. Ordinary townswomen took part in them not only singly, but also in groups.
The same things happened under Tatius' successor Domitian, as Suetonius describes in his Life of the 12 Caesars. Not only famous historians, but also many ancient Roman satirical poets such as Juvenal and Mercian mention female gladiators in their epigrams.
The fashion for female gladiatorial fights existed in ancient Rome even before Christ, and they became particularly popular under Emperor Nero. In the feasts organized by him in honor of his mother, a large number of women gladiators took part. Some of them were forced into the arena. Nero wanted to disgrace several noble families in this way, but many more free women became gladiators voluntarily, either for glory or for self-assertion, or even for fashion along with their friends. With whom did women fight in the arena? It depended on the status of the lady in gladiator's armor. Slaves sold as gladiators fought however they were ordered to. Noble or just free women usually participated in duels with the same woman, but sometimes they could take part in the baiting of wild beasts, if they themselves wished to do so. As far as we know, there were no fights between women and male gladiators. Female gladiators were often invited to participate in private performances in the homes of the patricians. usually for the entertainment of a jaded Roman public, and not fought to the death. Woman participation in gladiatorial games was officially forbidden by a decree of Emperor Septimus Severus in 200 AD, but it is unlikely that this prohibition was very strictly observed, judging by the inscription found by archaeologists from the city of Ostia, dedicated to the local magistrate maintaining women gladiatorial fights. The inscription is dated 3rd century AD, thought Ostia is very close to Rome. It is quite possible that female gladiators have been fighting in the arena as long as gladiatorial games themselves existed.